The engine roar hadn't even faded when Richard Sterling stepped off the tarmac stairs with another woman's hand laced through his, and Farah Sterling stood frozen beside her own suitcase, watching the husband she had built an empire for walk past her like she was a stranger who happened to be standing in his way. "You're still here," he said, not even slowing down. "I thought you'd have the decency to leave quietly." Before she could respond, he was gone, boarding his jet with his mistress, leaving her holding divorce papers she hadn't asked for and a life she no longer recognized. If you're watching this and you know exactly what it feels like to give everything to someone who threw it away, comment your city below. So I know how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next to Farah Sterling is going to change everything you think you know about power. The morning had started with hope. The kind of fragile, aching hope that only exists in a marriage that has been slowly dying for years while both people pretend otherwise. Farah had packed her bag the night before with the same care she used to take when Richard was nobody, when he was a 26-year-old coder living on ramen and borrowed server space, when she was the one paying rent on the tiny apartment they shared in Queens because his idea hadn't made $1 yet. She remembered folding his one good shirt into a suitcase back then, too, the shirt he wore to pitch meetings that rejected him 9 times before the 10th one said yes. She remembered believing in him before anyone else did believing in him, when her own father warned her that ambition without loyalty was a house built on sand. She should have listened to her father. Arthur Montgomery had been a quiet man, a mathematician who spent his final years hunched over notebooks, filled with equations nobody else understood. Equations, he said, would change everything one day. He died when Farah was 26, just 2 years into her marriage, and in the fog of grief she barely noticed when boxes of his research disappeared from her mother's house, moved by Richard himself, who said he was simply storing them somewhere safer. She had thanked him for it. She had actually thanked him. Now standing on the tarmac at Teterboro with her suitcase handle digging into her palm, she watched her husband's Maybach pull up beside his Gulfstream, and she watched the door open, and she watched a woman step out, who was not her, a woman in a red dress who laughed at something Richard said like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. "Richard." Farah's voice cracked on his name, and she hated herself for the crack. "Richard, what is this?" He turned to look at her. Then, and there was nothing in his eyes, not guilt, not even discomfort, just the flat, efficient look of a man closing out a business meeting that had run too long. "I was going to have someone handle this more delicately," he said, adjusting his cufflink, "but since you're here, we might as well get it over with." "Get what over with, Richard? This is our anniversary trip. I have my bag packed. I made reservations at the villa. There's no villa reservation anymore." He said it the way he might mention that a stock had dipped a few points. Unremarkable, expected. "There hasn't been for a month." Farah felt something cold slide down through her chest. "A month. Farah." He said her name like it was a chore. "You've known this was coming. We both have. I just finally did something about it." The woman in the red dress hovered a few feet away, scrolling through her phone as if this conversation, this unraveling of a 14-year marriage, was simply background noise to her. Farah looked at her, really looked at her, and recognized her suddenly from a company holiday party 8 months earlier. A marketing associate, younger than Farah by at least a decade, with the kind of easy, unearned confidence that comes from never having built anything, only benefited from what someone else built. Farah's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "You're doing this for her. I'm not doing this for anyone." Richard's tone sharpened the first real emotion he'd shown. "I'm doing this for me. Do you understand how long I've been suffocating in that house, in that marriage, playing the devoted husband, while you sat around doing nothing? I built Sterling FinTech from nothing, Farah. From nothing. And somewhere along the way, you decided that meant you got to just exist. Attend galas, sit on charity boards, spend my money." "Your money?" Something hot rose up through the cold in her chest. "I put a roof over our heads when you had nothing, Richard. I paid for the server space that ran your first algorithm. I remember every single sacrifice to you. That was 14 years ago." He waved a hand like he was swatting away an insect. "People change. Companies grow. I'm not the same broke kid you fell in love with, and frankly, neither are you the same woman I married. You're just older." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Farah couldn't breathe. Behind Richard, a member of his flight crew appeared at the base of the jet's stairs, glancing at his watch with the practiced patience of someone used to waiting on his employer's personal dramas. "Mr. Sterling, we're cleared for departure whenever you're ready." "1 minute." Richard didn't even look at the man. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, holding it out to Farah like it was nothing more than a dry cleaning receipt. "These are the papers. My lawyer will be in touch about the settlement terms. I'd advise you not to make this difficult. It won't end well for you if you try." Farah stared at the envelope without taking it. "You're serving me divorce papers on the tarmac." "I'm efficient." He set the envelope down on top of her suitcase since she wouldn't take it from his hand. "That's how I built everything I have. I don't waste time." 14 years, Richard." Her voice broke completely now, and she hated the tears that rose in her eyes because she had promised herself years ago she would never cry in front of him again. 14 years, and this is how you end it on an airport tarmac in front of your— She couldn't even say the word in front of her. "I thought it would be cleaner this way." He was already turning toward the stairs, already moving on, already halfway gone from a marriage he'd apparently checked out of long before this morning. No scenes at the house, no lawyers in the room. Just done. "Richard, wait." Farah reached for his arm, and he pulled it away like her touch burned him. "Don't," he said, and there was something almost like disgust in his voice. Now disgust that she found devastating, precisely because it felt so genuine. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." He walked up the stairs of the Gulfstream without looking back. The woman in the red dress gave Farah one last glance, not cruel exactly, just curious the way someone looks at roadkill. They're driving past, and then she followed him up into the cabin. The door sealed shut. The engines that had been idling began to spool up in earnest, and Farah stood there on the tarmac in the wind, kicked up by the jet, her hair whipping across her face, her suitcase beside her with a divorce envelope sitting on top of it like some kind of grotesque gift. She watched the plane taxi. She watched it turn onto the runway. She watched it accelerate and lift into the gray morning sky, watched it bank west and shrink smaller and smaller until it was just a glint of metal against the clouds. And then it was gone entirely, and the sound of its engines faded into nothing, and Farah Sterling stood completely alone on a private runway, holding 14 years of her life in her hands, realizing with a sick, sinking clarity that her marriage hadn't ended just now. It had ended a long time ago. She was only just now finding out. For a long moment she didn't move. The wind kept blowing. Somewhere behind her, ground crew members went about their business loading luggage onto another jet, chatting about weekend plans completely indifferent to the fact that a woman's entire life had just collapsed 20 feet away from them. Farah looked down at the envelope. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip it, but she picked it up anyway, because some stubborn part of her refused to leave it lying on the tarmac, like trash refused to give Richard the satisfaction of imagining her too broken to even hold the papers that ended her marriage. She opened it right there, standing in the wind, because she needed to know. She needed to see the words in black and white, needed proof that this was real and not some horrible dream she would wake up from. In the bed she shared with a man who apparently hadn't loved her in longer than she wanted to admit. The papers were thorough, clinically thorough. Grounds for divorce, irreconcilable differences, a note about an already scheduled mediation date 3 weeks out, and beneath all of it, a settlement proposal that made her stomach turn. A modest lump sum, no claim to Sterling FinTech equity, no claim to the properties acquired during the marriage beyond a small condo in Connecticut she barely remembered agreeing to years ago. It was insulting. It was the kind of offer you made to someone you assumed had no leverage, no lawyer, no fight left in them. He wasn't wrong to assume that, not entirely. Farah had spent the last several years slowly withdrawing from every aspect of Sterling FinTech's operations, trusting Richard's assurances that her involvement wasn't necessary anymore, that the company had grown beyond the scrappy startup days when she used to sit beside him, debugging code until 3 in the morning. She had let herself become decorative, a wife who attended galas and sat on the boards of charities that mattered more to public relations than to her own passions. She realized now, standing there with the papers trembling in her hands, that this had probably been intentional. that Richard had spent years quietly maneuvering her out of any position where she might understand what was actually happening inside the company that bore both their history and now apparently only his name. She folded the papers, put them back in the envelope, and walked back into the terminal with her suitcase rolling behind her, her legs moving on autopilot, while her mind spun through a hurricane of grief and fury and disbelief. The private terminal lounge was quiet, all soft leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the runway. The kind of place designed to make wealthy people feel comfortable while they waited for machines worth more than most houses to carry them somewhere else. Farah sat down heavily in one of the chairs and pulled out her phone to call her sister, the only person she trusted enough to hear this before she figured out how to say it to anyone else. The screen lit up, and then it didn't. No signal bars, no service indicator at all. Just a small red exclamation mark where the carrier name should have been. She frowned and tried again, tapping the screen, restarting the phone, watching it boot back up only to land on the same dead signalless screen. She told herself it was a fluke, some kind of local dead zone near the airport, and she stood to find a landline or ask the lounge staff for help. That was when she noticed the second problem. She'd meant to order a coffee, something warm to hold on to while she figured out her next move, and she reached for her wallet to hand her card to the young man behind the small lounge bar. He ran the card. He frowned. He ran it again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's saying the card's been declined." "That's not possible." Farah managed a thin, humiliated laugh. "Try it again." He did. Same result. She pulled out a second card and then a third, and each one returned the same quiet, devastating word. Declined, 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 declined. Her hands were fully shaking now, and it wasn't from the cold anymore. She excused herself from the counter and found a quiet corner of the lounge, sitting down hard in a chair by the window, and she opened her banking app on her phone, praying that the Wi-Fi in the lounge might let it load, even without cell service. It connected. The app loaded. And then it hit her like a physical blow. Account access restricted. Please contact your branch for assistance. She tried the joint checking account. Same message. She tried the savings account that held what she'd always assumed was a modest but meaningful cushion of her own money from a small inheritance and years of careful saving. Same message. She tried her personal credit card, the one under her maiden name that Richard had never touched, had never even known the exact balance of. Same message. Every single financial artery connecting her to the world she had lived in for 14 years had been severed within the span of what could only have been a few hours, timed with a precision that made her realize this hadn't been some spontaneous emotional decision on Richard's part. This had been planned, calculated, executed like a hostile takeover, which she understood now with a sickening clarity was exactly what it was. He hadn't just left her at the airport. He had made sure that by the time she processed what was happening, she would have no way to leave, no way to call for help, no way to even buy herself a cup of coffee. He had turned her from his wife into a stranded, penniless woman in the span of a single morning, and he had done it while smiling at another woman in a red dress. "No," Farah whispered to herself, gripping the arms of the chair. "No, this is not happening." But it was happening. It was happening right now in real time in a lounge full of strangers who had no idea that the elegant woman sitting by the window had just been financially erased by her own husband. She thought about screaming. She thought about crying. She thought about walking back out onto the tarmac and waiting there until anyone noticed that she had nowhere to go. Instead, something else began to move underneath the panic, something old and stubborn that she hadn't felt in years. It was the same instinct that had carried her through the lean years in Queens, back when she and Richard had nothing but each other, and a stubborn belief that things would work out if they just kept fighting. She had been that woman once, resourceful, unbreakable. Somewhere along the way, comfort had dulled that part of her, but it hadn't killed it. She looked down at her hand at the diamond on her finger that Richard had given her the day he sold his first major contract. The ring he'd once told her represented everything they'd built together. She thought about the jewelry in her bag, a few pieces she'd brought for the trip, worth enough combined to get her a hotel room and a plane ticket somewhere, anywhere that wasn't standing in the wreckage of a marriage that no longer existed. She was calculating exactly how she might sell a diamond ring in an airport lounge with a dead phone and no cash when the ground outside the window began to hum. It started as a low vibration. She felt more than heard a deep resonance that rattled faintly through the glass beside her, and she looked up to see every head in the lounge turning toward the windows. Out on the tarmac, a second aircraft was descending larger than anything else on the runway, larger even than Richard's Gulfstream had been. It was matte black from nose to tail, sleek and imposing, with none of the gaudy branding that decorated so many private jets belonging to men who wanted the world to know exactly how much money they had. This one didn't need to announce anything. It simply commanded attention through sheer silent presence. It touched down with barely a shudder, taxiing toward the terminal with the kind of controlled, unhurried movement that suggested whoever was inside never rushed for anyone. Farah watched it come to a stop just outside the lounge windows, and for a moment, she forgot her own crisis entirely, caught up in a strange, instinctive curiosity about who could possibly be arriving in something like that. The stairs descended, and a man stepped out. He moved like he owned the tarmac beneath his feet. Unhurried, deliberate, dressed in a dark suit with no tie, the kind of understated confidence that only comes from a man who has never once needed to prove anything to anyone in a room. He paused at the base of the stairs and scanned the terminal windows, and for a strange, suspended moment, Farah felt certain his eyes landed directly on her. She didn't recognize him at first. It had been years since she'd seen his face outside of a business magazine cover or a headline about some deal he'd closed that sent shockwaves through the industry. But when he started walking toward the terminal entrance with a purpose that made the ground crew step aside without being asked, recognition hit her like ice water. Nathaniel Pierce, Richard's oldest rival, the man Richard used to rant about at dinner parties, the man whose name alone could make her husband's jaw tighten with a jealousy he never fully admitted to. Nathaniel Pierce, who had built his own empire in the shadow of Sterling FinTech and somehow always managed to stay one step ahead, one deal smarter, one acquisition faster. What could he possibly want here? Why would a man like that be landing at a private terminal in a jet like that, walking with such obvious intention on the exact morning her entire world had been dismantled? The lounge doors opened, and the murmur of quiet conversation around her seemed to hush as heads turned to track him. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked directly toward the corner where Farah sat, frozen still, holding her phone, with its dead screen still gripping the arm of her chair like it was the only solid thing left in her life. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not pity. Something closer to recognition, like a man confirming a fact he already suspected to be true. Farah Montgomery. He said her maiden name, not Sterling, and something about that small detail sent a chill down her spine. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Do I know you? Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Not yet. He glanced briefly at the empty chair across from her, then back at her face. But I knew your father. The words hit her harder than anything Richard had said all morning. Her father had been dead for 6 years. Nobody outside her immediate family had mentioned him to her in longer than she could remember, and certainly not a man like Nathaniel Pierce, a man who existed in a world of hostile takeovers and billion-dollar mergers, a world that had nothing to do with a quiet mathematician who spent his final years scribbling equations in notebooks nobody understood. You knew my father. Farah's grip on the phone loosened, and it slid from her fingers onto the cushion beside her, forgotten. Why would you know my father? Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the lounge, taking in the other passengers. The staff behind the bar, the general publicness of the space, and something in his expression shifted into calculation. Not here, he said quietly. What I have to tell you is not the kind of conversation you want strangers overhearing, and I promise you, Mrs. Sterling. He paused, correcting himself with something that almost looked like distaste. Ms. Montgomery, once you hear it, you're going to understand why your husband was so desperate to leave before you had time to ask any real questions. Farah's mind was reeling, caught between the raw wound of Richard's betrayal and this bizarre, impossible interruption from a man she'd only ever known as a name. Richard spat with contempt at dinner parties. "I don't understand what's happening right now," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, all the composure she'd been clinging to, threatening to collapse entirely. "My husband just left me on a runway. My accounts are frozen. My phone doesn't work. And now you're telling me you knew my father who's been dead for 6 years? What is this? Some kind of cruel joke that you and Richard cooked up together? I promise you." Nathaniel said, his voice low and even, cutting through her rising panic with a calm that felt almost deliberate, like he had rehearsed exactly how to say this. "I am the furthest thing from anything Richard Sterling would ever orchestrate. In fact, everything I'm about to tell you is going to end his career." Something in the way he said it, flat and certain, without a trace of exaggeration, made Farah go very still. "Your account's being frozen." Nathaniel continued, lowering himself into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Your phone losing service the moment his plane took off, the timing of all of it. That wasn't heartbreak, Ms. Montgomery. That was strategy. Richard didn't just leave his wife this morning. He executed a plan he's likely been building for months, maybe longer, and I think you deserve to know exactly why." Farah felt her throat tighten. "Why would he need a plan? We're getting divorced. People get divorced." "People get divorced," Nathaniel agreed. "But not every divorce comes with a complete financial blackout designed to keep someone from asking questions before they have time to hire a lawyer. Richard didn't cut you off because he stopped loving you, Farah. He cut you off because he's terrified of what you might discover if you had the resources and the time to look." "Discover what?" The words came out sharper than she intended, fear and fury tangling together in her voice. "What could I possibly discover that's worth doing this to me?" Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes steady on hers, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped even lower, as though the words themselves were dangerous. The truth about where Sterling FinTech actually came from. The lounge around them seemed to fade into background noise. The clink of glasses at the bar, the low murmur of other travelers, all of it dissolving beneath the weight of what he was about to say. "I need you to think back," Nathaniel said, "to the early days, before the company had a name, before Richard had investors. Do you remember what he was working on before Sterling FinTech existed?" Farah's mind reeled backward through years of memory, back to that cramped apartment in Queens, back to nights spent watching Richard hunched over a laptop that ran too hot and made too much noise, back to the earliest version of the algorithm that would eventually become the foundation of everything he built. "He was working on a predictive trading model," she said slowly. "A way to analyze market patterns faster than existing systems. He used to say it was going to change everything." "It did change everything," Nathaniel said. "It's the algorithm that powers nearly every core function of Sterling FinTech today. It's the reason the company is worth what it's worth. It's the reason investors have poured billions into it over the last decade." "I know that," Farah said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I was there when he built it. I watched him build it." Nathaniel's expression didn't waver. "Did you watch him refine something that already existed?" The question hung in the air between them like something physical, and Farah felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to shift. "What are you saying?" Nathaniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward her. On the screen was a scanned document, handwritten in a script so familiar it made her chest ache before she even fully registered what she was looking at. Pages of dense mathematical notation equations layered with annotations in careful, precise handwriting, her father's handwriting. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, reaching out to touch the screen as though the document might dissolve if she moved too quickly. "This is a fragment of a much larger body of research your father developed in the years before his death," Nathaniel said. "Research on predictive modeling for financial markets. Research that, as far as I've been able to determine, disappeared from your family's possession shortly after he died and resurfaced in modified form as the foundational algorithm behind Sterling FinTech." Farah stared at the equations, at her father's careful handwriting, at notations she remembered seeing scattered across his desk when she was a young woman who thought her father's work was just an old man's harmless obsession, something to be humored rather than understood. "This isn't possible," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, memories were rearranging themselves in her mind click by click, fitting together into a shape she didn't want to see. Richard offering to store her father's research boxes after his death. Richard disappearing into his study for hours during the earliest days of what would become Sterling FinTech, refusing to let her see what he was working on, telling her it was better if she didn't know the technical details, that it would only confuse her. "It's more than possible," Nathaniel said quietly. "It's documented. I've spent the last 8 months building a case, working with forensic analysts who specialize in intellectual property theft, cross-referencing the earliest patent filings for Sterling FinTech's core algorithm against research your father was known to have been developing before his death. The similarities aren't coincidental, Farah. They're identical in structure, identical in the mathematical principles applied, differing only in variable names and minor cosmetic adjustments clearly designed to obscure the origin." Farah's hands were trembling now, not from cold or fear, but from something deeper, something that felt like the ground splitting open beneath everything she thought she knew about her own life. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why now? Why today of all days?" Nathaniel sat back slightly, and for the first time, something almost like sympathy crossed his features. "Because I've been waiting for the right moment, and Richard just handed it to me. I've known about this for months, Farah. I could have gone to the press, could have gone to regulators, could have destroyed him in the open market the moment I had enough evidence. But intellectual property cases are messy, especially when the original creator is deceased and the documentation is incomplete. I needed something stronger. I needed the person with the strongest legal claim to that research to be standing beside me when I made this public. Me, Farah said, understanding dawning slowly horribly alongside the grief and rage still churning in her chest. "You," Nathaniel confirmed. "As your father's only surviving heir, any intellectual property he developed and never formally transferred or sold legally belongs to you, which means Farah. That the algorithm powering Sterling FinTech, the algorithm that has made Richard Sterling one of the wealthiest men in the country, may very well belong to you. Not partially, not through some divorce settlement he'll try to lowball you on, entirely by right of inheritance, independent of your marriage altogether." The words landed on Farah like a physical weight, and for a long moment she couldn't speak at all. She thought about Richard's face on the tarmac flat, and cold, telling her not to make things difficult, warning her that it wouldn't end well for her if she tried. She thought about the modest, insulting settlement offer tucked inside the envelope on her lap. She thought about her accounts, frozen her phone dead, every avenue of resistance severed before she'd even had time to grieve. He hadn't done any of this because he stopped loving her. He had done it because he was afraid of her. He had been afraid of her for months, maybe longer. And everything about this morning, the mistress, the divorce papers, the financial blackout, all of it had been a desperate, calculated attempt to remove her from the board before she could ever learn the truth sitting right in front of her now. "He knew?" Farah said slowly, the realization settling into her bones like ice. "He knew I might find out eventually. That's why he did all of this. Not because our marriage was over, because he needed me gone before I could ask the right questions." "That's my assessment as well," Nathaniel said. "And it means we don't have much time. Once news of your divorce becomes public, Richard's legal team will move quickly to finalize a settlement that legally separates you from any claim to Sterling FinTech's assets, intellectual property included. If you sign what's in that envelope, Farah, you will be signing away your legal right to challenge the very foundation of his company permanently." Farah looked down at the envelope still resting on her lap, the papers inside suddenly feeling less like a divorce settlement and more like a trap specifically engineered to close around her before she understood what she was losing. "What do you want from me?" she asked, looking back up at Nathaniel, searching his face for the angle she was certain had to be there. Men like him didn't fly matte black jets into private terminals out of the goodness of their hearts. "You said you've been building this case for months. You clearly have your own reasons for wanting Richard destroyed. So what's in this for you?" Nathaniel didn't flinch from the question, and something about his directness made her trust him slightly more than she wanted to. "I've competed against Richard Sterling for 12 years, he said. He's undercut deals I spent years building. He's spread lies about my company to investors, and I have no illusions about the fact that part of me wants to see him lose everything simply because I dislike him as a person. But I'm not interested in helping you out of pure altruism, and I won't pretend otherwise. If this case moves forward and succeeds, and I believe it will, I stand to benefit significantly. Sterling FinTech's competitors, my company included, will absorb enormous value once the market realizes the algorithm underpinning their entire valuation is built on stolen research. That's the honest truth, Farah. I have skin in this game. At least you're not lying to me, Farah said quietly, and there was something almost like relief in the admission after a morning spent absorbing lie after lie from the man she'd trusted for 14 years. I have no reason to lie to you, Nathaniel said. I need you, and lying to you would only sabotage the one thing that actually matters here, which is that the claim is legitimate. Your father built something extraordinary, Farah, and it was stolen from him, and then it was stolen from you twice over, once when he died, and once again this morning when Richard tried to lock you out before you ever had the chance to understand what you stood to lose. Farah sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at her hands at the ring Richard had given her, at the divorce envelope resting beside it. Around her, the lounge continued its quiet hum of unaffected life travelers, checking phones, sipping coffee, completely unaware that a few feet away, a woman's entire understanding of her marriage, her husband, and her own inheritance was being dismantled and rebuilt in real time. If I do this, she said slowly, if I go with you, if we pursue this, there's no going back. Richard will fight this with everything he has. He'll drag my name through every headline in the country. He'll paint me as a bitter, vindictive ex-wife trying to steal a fortune I don't understand. He might try, Nathaniel said, but he'll be fighting a legal claim backed by documented research, forensic verification, and patent timeline analysis that any competent court will take seriously. This isn't a case built on emotion, Farah. It's built on evidence. Strong evidence. And once it becomes public, no amount of spin from Richard's PR team is going to change the fact that Sterling FinTech's core product may not legally belong to Sterling FinTech at all. Farah looked out the window at the black jet still waiting on the tarmac engines idling, and then she looked back at the empty sky where Richard's plane had disappeared less than an hour earlier, carrying him and his new life somewhere she was never meant to follow. He told me I'd land on my feet, she said quietly, almost to herself. He said it like a joke, like he already knew what he was taking from me and he didn't care. Did you believe him? Nathaniel asked. Farah looked down at the divorce papers one final time, then folded them shut and set them aside, no longer trembling. I think, she said, lifting her eyes to meet Nathaniel's, he's about to find out exactly how right he was, just not in the way he meant. Nathaniel almost smiled, though it never fully reached his eyes, something colder and more focused settling over his expression instead. Then we should go. Every hour we wait is an hour Richard's lawyers spend building walls around what's rightfully yours. And if I sign anything before we can act, you won't, Nathaniel said, standing and extending a hand toward her, not to help her up, but as a gesture of alliance, an offer she understood instinctively she could accept or refuse, and either choice would define the rest of her life. Because you're not getting on a commercial flight home to sit alone in an empty house waiting for his lawyers to call. You're coming with me. Farah looked at his outstretched hand, then at the black jet beyond the window, its silhouette stark and commanding against the gray morning sky, utterly unlike the gleaming white Gulf Stream that had carried her husband and his mistress away less than an hour before. 2 jets, 2 men, 2 futures splitting apart in front of her like a fork in a road she never expected to stand at. She thought of her father hunched over his notebooks in the quiet hours of the night, believing so completely in the value of what he was building, even when no one else did. She thought of the version of herself who once believed in someone that completely too, who sacrificed everything for a man who repaid her with a divorce envelope tossed onto a suitcase and a warning not to make things difficult. She was not going to be that woman anymore. Farah rose from the chair, left the divorce papers behind on the cushion where they belonged, and placed her hand in Nathaniel Pierce's. Take me to your jet, she said, her voice steady for the first time all morning. I want to see exactly how far this goes. As they walked together across the tarmac toward the waiting aircraft, the wind whipping around them just as it had when Richard's plane departed, Farah felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been buried under years of quiet compliance, finally breaking free. She was no longer the woman standing alone on a runway, discarded and forgotten. She was her father's daughter, and she was only just beginning to understand what that truly meant. The jet's cabin swallowed the sound of the tarmac the moment the door sealed shut, and Farah sat in a leather seat wider than any she'd known on Richard's aircraft, gripping the armrest as the engines built toward takeoff. Nathaniel sat across from her, already scrolling through documents on his tablet, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with everything that had just happened and everything that was about to. 23 minutes to Wheels Up in London, Nathaniel said without looking up. That gives you time to ask me anything you need to before we land, and this becomes real in a way you can't take back. Farah's throat was dry. Real how? The moment we touch down, I'm bringing in my legal team. Forensic accountants, IP litigators, people who don't work for free and don't work slowly. Once that machine starts, Farah, it doesn't stop for your feelings. It doesn't pause because you need a week to process your divorce. It moves at the speed of the market, and the market doesn't wait for anyone's grief. She looked out the window at the clouds sliding past beneath them, gray and endless, and thought about how strange it was that 6 hours ago she had been folding a sundress into a suitcase, imagining a villa in Lake Como, imagining Richard's hand in hers at dinner, imagining anything except this. I need to call my sister, she said suddenly. She doesn't know any of this happened. She's going to worry. Nathaniel reached into a compartment beside his seat and produced a phone, sleek and unmarked, handing it across to her. New number, untraceable to Richard's networks in case he has anyone monitoring for you trying to reach out. Call her. But Farah? He paused until she looked up at him. Don't tell her about your father's research yet. Not until we've secured everything. The fewer people who know before we're ready to move, the fewer chances Richard has to find out we're coming. Farah's hands trembled as she dialed the only number she still remembered by heart. Her sister Grace picked up on the second ring. Farah, oh my God, I've been calling you for an hour. Your phone kept going straight to some error message. Are you at the airport? Is everything... Grace. Farah's voice cracked, and everything she'd been holding together since the tarmac finally splintered. Richard left me. He served me divorce papers this morning, on the runway, in front of another woman. There was a stunned silence on the other end, and then Grace's voice low and furious. I'm going to kill him. Get in line, Farah said, and the small broken laugh that escaped her surprised even herself. Grace, listen to me. I don't have much time. I'm okay. I'm safe. I'm with someone who's helping me, and I'll explain everything soon. But I need you to trust me right now and not ask questions I can't answer yet. Farah, you're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry. I just need you to know I'm alive, I'm safe, and this isn't over. Not even close. She glanced at Nathaniel, who was watching her with something unreadable in his expression. I'll call you tonight. I promise. She hung up before Grace could argue, and the silence in the cabin pressed back in around her. Better? Nathaniel asked. No, Farah admitted, but necessary. He nodded, as if that was the only honest answer he'd expected, and turned his tablet toward her again. While we fly, I want to walk you through exactly what we're dealing with, because I need you to understand the scale of this before we land. This isn't a lawsuit over a stolen recipe or a knockoff logo, Farah. Sterling FinTech's entire valuation, all $41 billion of it, rests on a predictive trading algorithm your husband has spent a decade claiming as his own invention. If that algorithm is proven to have originated from your father's research, the legal and financial fallout will be seismic. Not just for Richard, for every investor, every board member, every institution that's built exposure to that stock, believing it was protected by legitimate intellectual property. So when you say destroy him, Farah said slowly, you don't just mean take the company from him. I mean, unmake the foundation he built his entire identity on, Nathaniel said. Richard Sterling isn't famous because he's charming Farah. He's famous because the market believes he's a genius who built something extraordinary from nothing. Strip that away, prove that the genius belonged to a quiet mathematician who died without recognition while his son-in-law took the credit, and Richard doesn't just lose a company, he loses the only thing he's ever actually cared about, his reputation. Farah thought of Richard's face on the tarmac flat and untouched by 14 years of shared history, and felt something harden inside her chest, where grief had been sitting only an hour before. "Good," she said quietly. "Let's begin." Nathaniel's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Then let's talk about timelines, because you're about to learn things about your marriage that are going to make this morning look gentle by comparison." Farah straightened in her seat. "Tell me." "Your father died in March 6 years ago," Nathaniel said, pulling up a document on the tablet, a scanned timeline populated with dates and small thumbnail images of old filings. Sterling FinTech's first patent application for its core predictive algorithm was filed in September of that same year, 6 months later. "Richard told me that patent took years to develop," Farah said, but even as the words left her mouth, she could hear how hollow they sounded now. "Years to develop filed within half a year of your father's death," Nathaniel said. "That timeline alone is suspicious, but it gets worse. I managed to obtain records showing that the storage facility where your father's research boxes were moved, the one Richard told you was, and I quote from an old company newsletter I found referencing early team lore, a secure archive for sensitive materials, was leased under a shell company registered to one of Richard's early investors. Not to Richard directly, carefully, deliberately obscured." Farah felt sick. He hid it. He didn't just take the research, he hid where he took it. "That's my read on it too," Nathaniel said. "And there's more. I spoke off the record with one of the original engineers who worked with Richard in those first 18 months of the company before non-disclosure agreements got tighter and turnover increased dramatically. He remembered something odd. He remembered Richard arriving one morning with, in his words, a breakthrough that came out of nowhere, and after months of the team hitting dead ends on the predictive modeling approach they'd been using, he said it felt like Richard had found someone else's notes and simply plugged them in. "Someone else's notes," Farah repeated, and the phrase landed like a stone in her stomach. "My father's notes." "I believe so," Nathaniel said. "I can't prove it in a courtroom yet, with a single engineer's recollection from a decade ago. Memory fades and any competent defense attorney will tear apart testimony that vague. But it corroborates the physical evidence, the timeline, the patent filings, the handwriting analysis we've already started on the fragments I showed you at the airport." "What do you need from me then?" Farah asked. "If the case is already this strong, why do you need me at all beyond legal standing?" Nathaniel set the tablet down and looked at her directly, and for the first time since he'd walked into that lounge, something in his expression softened slightly, not pity, but something closer to respect. "Because you knew your father in ways no forensic accountant ever will. You know his habits, his notation, shortcuts, the way he thought. If there's more research out there, additional boxes, files, backups, he might have kept somewhere Richard never found. You're the only person alive who might know where to look. And beyond that," he paused, "a jury, if this ever gets that far, isn't going to connect with spreadsheets and patent filings. They're going to connect with you. The daughter whose father's life work was stolen twice, once by death and once by a man who married her specifically because it gave him access to that research." The accusation embedded in that sentence hit Farah harder than anything else he'd said so far. "You think he married me for that? For my father's notebooks?" Nathaniel hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say. "I don't know that for certain. I know that you two met at a fundraiser your father hosted for a mathematics foundation roughly 8 months before your father's health began declining. I know Richard's early attempts at his algorithm were failing badly before that meeting, and that his breakthrough came suspiciously soon after he gained access to your family and eventually your father's estate. I'm not saying he calculated the entire relationship as a corporate espionage scheme from the very first date. I don't think even Richard is that coldly efficient. But I do think somewhere along the way, he recognized what he had access to through you, and he took it. And once he had what he needed, the marriage itself became redundant." Farah sat in silence, feeling the plane hum beneath her, feeling 14 years of memory rearrange themselves violently in her mind. The night Richard proposed on a rooftop overlooking the city, telling her she was the only person who'd ever believed in him before he had anything to offer. Had that been true? Or had it always been about what she carried without knowing it, tucked away in boxes in her mother's basement? "I need air," she said abruptly, unbuckling her seatbelt and standing though there was nowhere on the plane to go that would actually give her that. Nathaniel didn't try to stop her. "Take the time you need. We still have hours before London." She walked to the small lavatory at the rear of the cabin, locked the door, and stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, staring at her own reflection, a woman she barely recognized. Mascara smudged beneath her eyes, hair windblown and unkempt from the tarmac, a stranger's face wearing her own features. "You are not going to fall apart," she told her reflection, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not now, not when you finally have a reason to fight." She splashed cold water on her face, straightened her blouse, and looked at herself one more time before unlocking the door. When she returned to her seat, something in her posture had changed straighter, harder, and Nathaniel noticed immediately. "Better?" he asked. "Focused," she corrected. "Tell me what happens once we land." For the next 2 hours, Nathaniel walked her through the machinery of what was coming. A legal team assembling in London, chosen specifically for their experience with complex intellectual property litigation and their willingness to move fast and aggressively. Forensic document specialists who would authenticate every page of her father's research against the patent filings. A public relations strategist who would control the narrative the moment the story broke, ensuring Farah was framed not as a bitter, spurned wife, but as a wronged heir, reclaiming what was legally hers. "There's something else you need to know," Nathaniel said as the plane began its slow descent through the clouds, the lights of London starting to glitter faintly below them. "Richard's going to fight dirty. The moment his lawyers realize what's happening, and it won't take long once we file, he's going to try to paint you as unstable, vindictive, possibly even mentally unwell. It's a common defense tactic in cases like this. Attack the credibility of the person making the claim rather than the claim itself." "Let him try," Farah said, and the coldness in her own voice surprised her. "I need you prepared for it," Nathaniel pressed. "Because it's going to be ugly, Farah. He's going to leak stories to the press. He's going to have people who barely know you giving quotes about your, and I'm using the language his PR team will likely use, fragile emotional state, following the divorce. He's going to do everything possible to make the public doubt your claim before the evidence even reaches a courtroom." Farah's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure the evidence reaches the public before his lies do." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, approval, maybe even surprise. "Now you're thinking like someone who's about to win this." The plane touched down at a private airfield outside London, just as evening settled over the city, and a black car was waiting on the tarmac engine, already running. Nathaniel guided her toward it, with a hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching, but present, and Farah found herself grateful for the small, steadying gesture after a day that had stripped away nearly everything else familiar. The car wound through wet London streets toward a nondescript building in a financial district she didn't recognize, and Nathaniel explained as they rode that this was one of several properties he kept for situations requiring absolute discretion. "No paper trail connecting you to me until we're ready to make this public," he said. "Richard's people will be looking for you the moment they realize you didn't quietly disappear like he expected. I intend for them to find nothing." The building's interior was sleek and modern, all-glass conference rooms and soft lighting, and when they stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor, Farah found herself facing a small assembled team, already waiting laptops, open papers, spread across a long table. "This is Farah Montgomery," Nathaniel announced to the room, and Farah noted with a small jolt that he'd used her maiden name again deliberately, a signal to everyone present that she was here as her father's heir, not as Richard Sterling's soon-to-be ex-wife. "As of this evening, she's the lead claimant in what I expect to become the largest intellectual property case this industry has seen in a decade. I want full documentation review completed within 72 hours. I want the forensic handwriting analysis expedited, and I want a preliminary filing draft ready before the end of the week." A sharp-featured woman near the head of the table rose and extended her hand toward Farah. "Vivian Cho, I'll be leading litigation strategy. It's an honor to meet you, Miss Montgomery, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Farah shook her hand, feeling suddenly acutely aware of how surreal the last 12 hours had become. That morning she had been a wife preparing for a romantic getaway. Now she stood in a glass conference room in London, surrounded by strangers preparing to dismantle a billion-dollar empire on her behalf. "What do you need from me first?" Farah asked, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady. Vivian gestured toward a chair at the table. "Everything you remember about your father's research process. Every notebook you might have seen, every conversation about his work, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed at the time. We need to build a complete picture of his methodology so we can demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that what Sterling FinTech is using didn't emerge independently." For the next 3 hours, Farah sat at that table and did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She talked about her father. Really talked about him, not the sanitized grief speech she gave at his memorial, but the real details, the way he used to hum old jazz records, while he worked the specific green notebooks he insisted on buying from one stationery shop in Boston because he claimed the paper held ink differently. The late nights she'd find him at the kitchen table surrounded by coffee cups muttering equations to himself like poetry. "He used a specific shorthand," she said at one point, and Vivian's head snapped up from her notes. "A kind of personal notation system. He said it was faster than writing everything out in standard mathematical language. I remember him joking that if anyone ever stole his notebooks, they'd have no idea what they were reading unless they knew his system." "Can you read it?" Vivian asked, leaning forward. "Some of it," Farah said slowly, the memory sharpening as she spoke. "He taught me pieces of it when I was younger. I was never as gifted as he was, but I understood enough." Nathaniel and Vivian exchanged a look across the table, and Farah understood instantly what that look meant. If she could read her father's private notation system and cross-reference it against the algorithm Sterling FinTech was using, she might be able to identify direct, undeniable correlations that no generic patent lawyer would ever catch. Correlations that would prove beyond any reasonable doubt exactly whose mind had built the foundation of Richard's empire. "I want to see the algorithm," Farah said, suddenly sitting up straighter. "The actual code or the mathematical models Sterling FinTech has filed publicly. If my father's shorthand is embedded in the underlying logic, even disguised, I might recognize it." "That's incredibly ambitious," Vivian said carefully. "The public filings are dense, and Richard's team has had years to obscure the origins if they were worried about exactly this kind of discovery." "I don't care how ambitious it is," Farah said, and something in her tone silenced the room. "That man stood on a runway this morning and told me I'd land on my feet like it was some kind of joke. He froze my accounts before I even had time to process what was happening to my marriage. He is not getting to walk away from what he did to my father, too. Show me the filings." Nathaniel nodded slowly, something like admiration crossing his features again. "Pull the public patent documentation," he told one of the junior associates. "All of it. Every amendment, every revision filed over the past decade." The associate returned 20 minutes later with a thick binder, and Farah spent the next hour poring over pages of dense technical language, her father's voice echoing in her memory as she worked translating fragments of formal notation back into the shorthand he'd once shown her, searching for patterns that matched what she remembered from his green notebooks all those years ago. And then she found it. "Here," she said, her finger pressed against a section of the filing, her voice suddenly unsteady. "This variable structure, this exact sequencing, my father used this same pattern in a notebook I remember him working on the year before he died. He called it his cascade method. I remember because I asked him why he used that word, and he told me it was because errors in early-stage predictions would trickle down and correct themselves through each subsequent layer, like water finding its path down a rock face." Vivian leaned over this page, her eyes scanning rapidly. "That's an incredibly specific, non-standard structural choice. If your father was using this exact cascading correction method years before Sterling FinTech's patent filing, and there's no prior art anywhere else in the industry using this same approach—" "There isn't," Nathaniel confirmed, already pulling up something on his own laptop. "I had my technical team run a full landscape search months ago. This cascading correction structure appears nowhere in academic literature, nowhere in competing patent filings prior to Sterling FinTech's application. It's unique, it's distinctive, And if Farah can prove her father was using it in private notes years before that application, then there's no reasonable explanation for Richard's algorithm using the identical structure, Vivian finished, other than direct derivation from stolen research. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over everyone present. And Farah felt something powerful and unfamiliar rising in her chest, something that felt almost like her father's presence in the room, vindicated after 6 years of silence. "We need those original notebooks," Vivian said. "The physical documents. Digital scans of fragments are compelling, but the original handwritten notebooks properly authenticated, dated, and cross-referenced. That's what turns this from a strong circumstantial case into an airtight one." Farah's stomach dropped. "I don't know where they are. Richard told me he was storing them safely after my father died. I never saw them again. I assumed they were just old papers he was keeping out of respect, and eventually I stopped thinking about them at all." "Do you have any idea where he might have stored them?" Nathaniel asked. "Any property storage facilities? Anything he might have mentioned, even in passing?" Farah closed her eyes, forcing herself back through years of half-remembered conversations, searching for any thread that might lead somewhere useful. "There's a house," she said slowly. "Upstate. Richard bought it years ago, told me it was an investment property he rarely used. I only went there once early in the marriage. He kept a locked room in the basement he said was for server equipment, sensitive company data. I never questioned it." Nathaniel and Vivian exchanged another loaded glance. "That's exactly the kind of place a man like Richard would hide something he never wanted discovered," Nathaniel said. "Private property, minimal staff, plausible deniability if anyone ever asked what was inside." "We can't just break into a house he owns," Farah said, though even as she said it, she felt the old familiar hesitation, the instinct to avoid conflict, to smooth things over, and she hated herself a little for still having it after everything that had happened today. "No," Vivian agreed. "But if you still have legal standing as his wife, at least until the divorce is finalized, you may have grounds to request access to marital property for the purpose of retrieving personal items. It's a legal gray area, but a well-timed motion combined with the fact that the divorce isn't finalized yet could give us a legitimate pathway in." "How fast can you file something like that?" Farah asked. "Within 48 hours, Vivian said. "But Farah, I need to warn you, the moment we file anything using your married name in connection with property access, Richard's team will know something is happening. It will alert him that you're not simply disappearing quietly like he expected." Farah thought of Richard's face on the tarmac, cold and dismissive, telling her not to make things difficult. She thought of the divorce papers, insulting in their modesty, designed for a woman he assumed had no fight left in her. "Let him know," she said. "Let him spend the next few days panicking about what I might be planning, because for the first time since he left me standing on that runway, I want him to feel exactly what uncertainty feels like." Nathaniel's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pride. "Then we file first thing tomorrow morning." That night, alone in a private apartment Nathaniel's company kept for exactly this kind of situation, Farah sat by a window overlooking the London skyline, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pressing down on every part of her body. Her phone, the untraceable one Nathaniel had given her, buzzed with a text from Grace. "Please tell me you're actually okay. I've been staring at my phone all day." Farah typed back slowly. "I'm more than okay. I think I finally understand what Dad was trying to build all those years, and I think I'm about to finish it for him." Grace's response came quickly. "What does that mean?" Farah looked out at the city lights, at a version of her life she never could have imagined 24 hours earlier, and typed the only answer that felt true. "It means Richard Sterling has no idea what's coming for him." She set the phone down and pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass, watching her own reflection ghosted faintly over the skyline, and for the first time since standing alone on that tarmac, she didn't feel like a woman who had been discarded. She felt like a weapon that had just been loaded. Somewhere across the ocean, in a penthouse he'd once shared with her, Richard Sterling was sleeping soundly, utterly unaware that within 48 hours, a legal motion bearing his wife's name would land on his desk like the first tremor before an earthquake, the opening move in a war he didn't yet know he was fighting against an opponent he had drastically, catastrophically underestimated. Morning in London arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of low, heavy sky that made the glass tower housing Nathaniel's legal team feel even more like a fortress. Farah hadn't slept more than 2 hours, her mind cycling endlessly through her father's handwriting, Richard's cold voice on the tarmac, and the locked basement room in the upstate house she'd once dismissed as nothing more than server storage. She arrived at the office before 8, and Vivian Cho was already there, along with 3 additional lawyers Farah hadn't met the night before, all of them clustered around a conference table covered in printouts. "We filed the motion an hour ago," Vivian said without preamble, gesturing for Farah to sit. "Request for supervised access to the upstate property to retrieve personal and family items predating the marriage. It's narrowly worded, so it doesn't tip our hand about the algorithm, but it will absolutely alert Richard's team that you're not walking away quietly." "How long until he responds?" Farah asked, sitting down and accepting the coffee someone slid toward her. "Could be hours. Could be tonight," Vivian said. "Men like Richard Sterling don't like surprises, and this is going to feel like one, even though legally it's a completely ordinary request." As if summoned by the words themselves, Nathaniel walked in holding his phone, his expression unreadable but sharp. "It's already moving faster than I expected," he said. "Richard's lead counsel just called my office. Not yours, Farah, mine, which tells me he already suspects I'm involved." Farah's stomach tightened. "What did they say? They want a meeting," Nathaniel said. "Today, Richard's team is requesting an in-person conversation before this motion proceeds any further, and they specifically asked that you be present." "That's insane," Vivian said immediately. "There's no reason to accommodate a demand like that this early. We hold the leverage right now. Meeting with him plays directly into his hands, gives him a chance to manipulate her before we're fully prepared." "I want to go," Farah said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her. "Farah," Nathaniel said carefully, "you understand what you'd be walking into. Richard is going to use every tool he has to destabilize you emotionally before this even reaches a courtroom. That's exactly the kind of environment where mistakes happen." "I understand exactly what I'd be walking into," Farah said, straightening in her chair, feeling something steady settle into her spine that hadn't been there 24 hours earlier. "And I want him to look at me and realize I'm not the woman he left crying on a runway. I want to watch his face when he understands that I'm the reason his empire is about to collapse." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, weighing something silently, and then he nodded slowly. "Then we go in on our terms. Neutral location. My people present. And Farah, you say nothing about the algorithm, nothing about your father's research, not yet. We let him believe this is still just about a property dispute. We watch how much he already suspects." The meeting was set for 2 o'clock that afternoon in a private conference suite at a hotel. Neither side had any prior connection to a deliberately neutral battlefield. Farah spent the hours beforehand pacing the London office, rehearsing composure, rehearsing the blank, unreadable expression Richard had worn on the tarmac, determined to give him nothing to read. When she walked into the conference room that afternoon with Nathaniel and Vivian flanking her, Richard was already seated at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 lawyers in dark suits. His expression carefully neutral, though Farah caught the flicker of surprise, quickly masked, when he registered exactly who had walked in beside her. "Nathaniel Pierce," Richard said, his voice tight with forced civility. "I should have guessed." "Richard." Nathaniel's tone was almost pleasant, which somehow made it more unsettling. "It's been a while." Richard's eyes moved to Farah, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been genuine unease. "You work fast," he said to her, and there was an edge beneath the words, testing, probing. "Yesterday you're crying on a tarmac. Today you're walking in with my biggest competitor." "You left me with frozen accounts and a dead phone, Richard," Farah said, keeping her voice level, refusing to let the old flinch of accommodating him take hold. "I'd say I adapted quickly. You should be proud. You always said I was resourceful." One of Richard's lawyers cleared his throat and opened a folder. "We're here regarding the motion filed this morning, requesting access to the property in question. My client is prepared to grant reasonable access under supervision, provided the items retrieved are limited strictly to personal effects unrelated to any business assets." "That's acceptable," Vivian said smoothly, "provided we retain the right to catalog every item removed with independent verification present." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, and Farah watched him, carefully watched the calculation working visibly behind his composed exterior. What exactly are you looking for up there, Farah? You barely visited that house. I'm struggling to understand what personal effects you'd have any interest in retrieving. This was the moment. Farah felt Nathaniel's earlier warning echo in her mind, say nothing about the algorithm, and she held Richard's gaze evenly. My father's belongings, she said simply. Things you told me you were keeping safe for me after he died. I'd like them back. Something shifted behind Richard's eyes. A flicker of genuine alarm quickly suppressed, and Farah felt a surge of grim satisfaction at having found the crack in his composure. He recovered quickly, forcing a small dismissive laugh. Is that what this is about? Some old notebooks, Farah, I stored those years ago as a favor to you. I don't even remember what's still up there. Boxes of research nobody but your father ever understood. Then it should be simple to grant access, Nathaniel said smoothly, cutting in before Farah could respond. If they're truly nothing more than sentimental family items, there's no reason for further delay. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Farah watched him glance briefly at his lawyers, some silent, urgent calculation passing between them. Fine, he said finally, his voice clipped. Access granted, supervised, this weekend. But Farah, his eyes cut back to her colder now, all pretense of civility dropping away. I hope you understand that whatever game you think you're playing with him, he nodded toward Nathaniel without looking at him. It ends the moment you sign the settlement I offered you. Don't complicate something that could be simple. You mean don't complicate something you assumed would be easy, Farah corrected quietly. Because you assumed I had nothing left to fight with. Richard's expression flickered again, something almost like uncertainty passing behind his eyes, before he masked it once more. I don't know what you think you're building here, Farah, but I'd advise caution. I have resources you can't begin to imagine, and I will use every single one of them if you try to make my life difficult. Duly noted, Nathaniel said, rising from his chair, signaling the meeting's end before Richard could say anything further. We'll see you and your team this weekend at the property then. Supervised access, full documentation. As they filed out of the conference room, Farah felt Richard's eyes on her back the entire way, and just before the door closed behind them, she glanced over her shoulder one last time and saw something in his expression that hadn't been there on the tarmac. Fear. It was small, carefully controlled. But it was there, and Farah carried the sight of it with her like a small, glowing ember all the way back to the car. He's scared, she said once they were inside the London streets blurring past the windows. He should be, Nathaniel said. Did you see his lawyers? The way they exchanged glances when you mentioned your father? They know something, Farah. Or at minimum, they suspect. Richard spent years building walls around this secret, and today you just showed him you're standing right outside the one door he never thought anyone would find. That night, back in the apartment overlooking the skyline, Farah's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, not Grace, not anyone from the legal team. She answered cautiously. Farah. Richard's voice, low and unmistakable, sent a jolt of cold through her chest. How did you get this number? She asked, though she already suspected the answer involved resources she couldn't compete with. That doesn't matter, Richard said. What matters is that I think we should talk, just us. No lawyers, no Nathaniel Pierce hovering in the background feeding you ideas that aren't yours. Everything I've said today has been entirely mine, Richard. Has it? His voice sharpened. Because the woman I left at that airport yesterday wasn't talking about lawsuits and forensic accountants. She was standing there in shock, holding divorce papers completely lost. And now, less than 48 hours later, you're walking into meetings with my biggest rival like you've been planning a corporate war your entire life. Forgive me if I find that transformation a little convenient. Maybe you just never bothered to see who I actually was, Farah said, gripping the phone tighter. You were too busy deciding I existed to be decorative. There was a long pause on the line, and when Richard spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something quieter, almost pleading. Farah, whatever Nathaniel's told you, whatever he's convinced you to believe, I need you to understand he doesn't care about you. He cares about destroying me, and he's using you to do it. Don't let old grief about your father get twisted into some corporate revenge fantasy that isn't even yours. The mention of her father delivered so casually, so carelessly, sent something cold and clarifying through Farah's chest. Tell me something, Richard, she said slowly. If there's truly nothing up in that house worth worrying about, Why does my mentioning my father's notebooks make you so nervous that you're calling me at 11 at night on a number I never gave you?" Silence stretched on the other end of the line, long enough that Farah almost thought the call had dropped. "Be careful, Farah." Richard finally said, his voice flat again, all warmth gone. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." "Neither did you," Farah said quietly, "when you decided leaving me at that airport was a good idea." She hung up before he could respond, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down on the table, but this time the trembling wasn't from fear. It was adrenaline. It was the unmistakable electric feeling of watching a man who had once controlled every aspect of her life finally begin to lose his grip on the narrative. She texted Nathaniel immediately. "Richard just called me. He's scared. He all but confirmed there's something in that house he doesn't want found." Nathaniel's response came within a minute. "Good. Fear makes men careless. Get some sleep. This weekend we find out exactly what he's been hiding." Farah set the phone down and looked out at the London skyline one final time, before finally, for the first time in over 30 hours, allowing herself to close her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in something that felt for the first time since the tarmac dangerously close to hope. The car crossed the state line just before noon, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the upstate property came into view through the rain-streaked windshield, and Farah felt her pulse quicken at the sight of the house she'd only visited once years ago, back when she still believed every door Richard kept locked was simply none of her business. "Remember," Nathaniel said from beside her, his voice low, "supervised access means his people will be watching everything we do. Stay calm, stay focused. Don't give them anything to use against you." "I know," Farah said, though her hands were pressed flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. "I've been rehearsing calm since London." Vivian sat across from them, a folder open on her lap, reviewing the terms of access one final time. "Richard's team confirmed 2 representatives will meet us there, his personal attorney and a security consultant. They're framing this as a courtesy, but make no mistake, they're here to monitor exactly what we find and try to control the narrative, if it's anything more than sentimental keepsakes." The car pulled up the long drive, and Farah's breath caught at the sight of the house itself, larger than she remembered, all dark stone and tall windows, the kind of property designed to be forgotten rather than lived in. 2 men were already waiting on the front steps, one in an expensive suit despite the drizzle, the other built like security, watchful and silent. "Ms. Montgomery." The attorney extended a hand as she stepped out of the car, his voice smooth with practiced politeness that did nothing to disguise the tension underneath it. "Mr. Sterling asked me to remind you that access is strictly limited to personal non-business items per the terms of the agreement." "I remember the terms," Farah said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Let's go inside." The interior of the house was cold, unused furniture, draped in white sheets like a home mourning its own abandonment. Farah led the group through the main hall, memory guiding her more than certainty, until she reached the narrow staircase descending toward the basement level. "This way," she said, and the security consultant fell into step just behind her, close enough to feel like a threat. The basement door was locked exactly as she remembered, but this time Nathaniel's team had come prepared. A locksmith Vivian had arranged in advance made quick work of the mechanism, and within minutes the heavy door swung open to reveal a narrow room lined with metal shelving, humming faintly with the sound of old servers still drawing power after all these years. "Careful," the attorney said quickly, stepping forward. "Some of this equipment may contain proprietary company data. I'll need to review anything before it leaves the premises." "We're not here for the servers," Nathaniel said evenly. "We're here for personal family items belonging to Arthur Montgomery. That was the explicit scope of this agreement, and I'd advise you to remember it." Farah moved past the shelving units, her eyes scanning the room, searching for anything that felt familiar, anything that might connect to the boxes she remembered from her mother's basement all those years ago. Near the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of outdated hardware, she spotted them. Cardboard boxes, water-stained at the corners, labeled in handwriting she recognized instantly, even from across the room. "There," she said, her voice catching. "Those are his." She crossed the room and knelt beside the first box, her hands trembling as she peeled back the flaps, and the smell hit her before anything else. Old paper and dust, and something faintly like her father's aftershave, a scent so specific it nearly buckled her knees. Inside, stacked with the same meticulous care he'd always kept, were dozens of green notebooks exactly as she remembered them. Their spines cracked from years of use, pages yellowed, but intact. "Farah." Nathaniel crouched beside her, his voice gentler than she'd heard it since the airport. "Take your time." She lifted the first notebook with both hands, opening it to a random page, and her father's handwriting spilled across the paper in dense, careful lines of mathematical notation, exactly the shorthand she remembered him teaching her as a girl. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them, and for a moment, the room around her disappeared entirely, replaced by memory. Her father at the kitchen table, pen moving steadily, humming some old record under his breath. "This is everything," she whispered. "He kept everything." The attorney cleared his throat from across the room, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display, but unwilling to interrupt it directly. "We'll need an inventory of anything removed from the premises." "You'll get one," Vivian said crisply, already photographing each box from multiple angles, cataloging contents with rapid practiced efficiency. Every page documented and timestamped starting now. For the next hour, Farah worked alongside Vivian's team, carefully cataloging box after box, her grief slowly transforming into something sharper, more purposeful, as page after page revealed the true depth of her father's work. Equations that spanned years of development. Draft after draft of the cascading correction method Nathaniel's team had identified in Sterling FinTech's patent filings. And then, near the bottom of the third box, something that made Farah's entire body go still. A notebook dated 8 months before her father's death, its cover slightly different from the others, and inside, alongside the familiar mathematical notation, a series of dated journal entries in her father's handwriting, personal reflections he'd apparently kept alongside his research. She read the first entry silently, her lips moving faintly as she absorbed the words. "Richard came by again today, asking more questions about the cascade model. He's sharper than I expected, understands the math faster than most of the graduate students I've worked with. I should be flattered by his interest, but something about the way he asks feels less like curiosity and more like extraction. I've decided to hold back the final refinements until I understand his intentions better." Farah's breath caught, and she flipped forward several pages, finding another entry dated just weeks before her father's death. "Richard asked to borrow my notebooks again today, said he wanted to study the cascade method more closely for a project he's developing. I told him no. Something isn't right. I don't trust him the way Farah does, though. I would never tell her that. She's happier than I've seen her in years, and I won't be the one to put doubt in her heart. But I intend to make copies of everything and store the originals somewhere he doesn't know about just to be safe. Nathaniel." Farah's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room instantly, and he was beside her within seconds. "Read this." He scanned the entry, his expression darkening with each line. "He suspected Richard. Before he died, your father suspected Richard was after his research. He said he was going to hide the originals somewhere Richard didn't know about," Farah said, her mind racing, "which means these boxes, the ones Richards had access to all this time, might not even be the complete research. There could be more." Vivian's head snapped up from her cataloging. If your father hid a second set of materials somewhere entirely separate from what Richard eventually gained access to, that would be catastrophic for Richard's defense. It would prove definitively that he knew the material was proprietary, and contested that he pursued it anyway, and that he spent years building a company on research he understood even at the time wasn't fully his to use. "Where would he hide something like that?" Nathaniel asked, turning to Farah. "Think, Farah. Anywhere your father might have trusted somewhere private, somewhere Richard never had reason to look." Farah closed her eyes, forcing herself back through fragmented memories of her father's final months, searching for anything that might point toward an answer. And then it came to her sudden and clear. "The cabin," she said, her eyes snapping open. "He had a small cabin upstate near the lake where he used to take me fishing as a kid. It wasn't in his name, not officially. He'd inherited it from his brother, my uncle, and I don't think he ever formally transferred the deed. Richard never knew about it. It never came up because it wasn't part of the estate paperwork. It slipped through some kind of legal gap after Uncle Theodore passed." Nathaniel and Vivian exchanged a charged glance. That could be exactly what we're looking for, Vivian said. A property completely outside Richard's knowledge or control. I haven't been there in years, Farah admitted. Not since before my father died. I don't even know if it's still standing. Then we find out, Nathaniel said, already pulling out his phone. Today, if possible. The attorney, who had been hovering nearby trying to follow the conversation, stepped forward with visible suspicion. Is there a problem? Anything discussed regarding additional properties needs to be disclosed if it pertains to marital assets. It doesn't pertain to marital assets, Farah said coolly, straightening to face him directly. It's a family property that predates my marriage, entirely inherited independently through my father's estate. Nothing about it falls under your client's purview. The attorney's jaw tightened, clearly unsatisfied, but unable to argue the point without more information he didn't have. I'll need to inform Mr. Sterling of this development. Inform him of whatever you'd like, Nathaniel said, stepping in smoothly. We've fulfilled every term of today's agreement. The scope of access was clearly defined, and we've stayed well within it. As the team finished cataloging the final boxes, loading them carefully into a secure vehicle Nathaniel had arranged, Farah found herself standing alone for a moment near the basement door, looking back at the room that had held her father's stolen legacy for 6 years, hidden just feet from where Richard had built his fortune. She thought about the journal entry, her father's quiet, private suspicion of the man she'd married, his careful decision to protect his work without ever telling her, without ever wanting to plant doubt in a happiness he thought was real. Guilt and grief tangled together in her chest, but beneath both of them, something harder was forming, something that felt almost like her father's presence steadying her from somewhere just out of reach. I'm going to finish what you started, she thought. I'm going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what he did to you. The drive back toward the city was quiet, the boxes secured in the trunk of a second vehicle following close behind, and Farah stared out the window at the passing countryside, her mind already racing ahead toward the cabin, toward whatever additional evidence might be waiting there undiscovered for 6 long years. Her phone buzzed. Grace again. Any update? I'm losing my mind over here, Farah typed back carefully. Found Dad's notebooks today. There's more to this than I ever imagined. I'll explain everything soon, I promise. Just trust me a little longer. I trust you, Grace wrote back almost immediately. I just wish I could help. You can, Farah typed. Do you remember Uncle Theodore's cabin near Silver Lake? There was a pause before Grace responded, vaguely. We only went there a couple times as kids. Why? I think Dad hid something there before he died. Something important. I need to go, and soon. Then I'm coming with you, Grace wrote, and something in the simple certainty of those words brought unexpected tears to Farah's eyes. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Farah looked up from the phone toward Nathaniel, who was watching her with quiet attentiveness. My sister wants to come with us to the cabin, she said. I think I want her there too. She's the only person left who might remember anything useful about the property, and honestly, after everything that's happened, I don't want to face this without family beside me. That's reasonable, Nathaniel said, though something careful entered his tone. But Farah, once Grace is involved directly, once she knows the full scope of what we're building, there's no undoing that. She'll need to understand the stakes, the danger, everything Richard's capable of if he feels cornered. She's stronger than people give her credit for, Farah said, just like I apparently was and didn't know it until yesterday. They arranged to meet Grace at the airfield the following morning, and Nathaniel's jet carried them north toward the small regional airport closest to Silver Lake, the cabin's location marked on an old map Farah had found tucked among her father's papers years ago and never thought to use again until now. Grace was waiting when they landed, and the moment Farah stepped off the plane, her sister crossed the tarmac at a near run, pulling her into a fierce, desperate hug that finally fully broke the composure Farah had been holding together for 2 exhausting days. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered into her shoulder. I'm so sorry he did this to you. I'm okay, Farah said, though her voice cracked on the words. I promise, Grace, I'm more than okay. I finally understand what's happening, and I finally have a way to fight back. Grace pulled back, studying her sister's face with the particular intensity only siblings share. You look different, she said slowly. Not broken, different. I feel different, Farah admitted. The drive to the cabin took nearly an hour along narrow, winding roads that grew increasingly unfamiliar the further they traveled from the airfield memory, guiding Farah more than any map fragments of childhood summers, surfacing unexpectedly at each turn. When the small structure finally came into view, weathered and half swallowed by overgrown brush, Farah felt her chest tighten with a complicated wave of nostalgia and dread. "It's still standing," Grace said softly, awe and grief mingling in her voice. "I can't believe it's still standing." The lock on the front door had rusted nearly solid, and it took several minutes of careful work from Nathaniel's security consultant to finally force it open. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed for years, furniture covered in yellowed sheets, everything exactly as it must have been left the last time their father visited. Where would he have hidden something? Vivian asked, stepping carefully through the small space. Somewhere that wouldn't be obvious to a casual visitor, but accessible enough that he could retrieve it if needed. Farah moved through the cabin slowly, memory and instinct guiding her steps, until she found herself standing before the old stone fireplace at the room's center. Remembering suddenly vividly her father showing her as a child a small compartment hidden behind one of the loose stones near the base. "Here," she said, kneeling down her fingers, finding the exact stone she remembered working it loose with trembling hands. Behind it, a small metal box rusted at the edges but intact, sat waiting exactly where memory told her it would be. "Farah." Grace's voice was barely a whisper beside her. With shaking hands, Farah pulled the box free and set it on the dusty floor, working the simple latch until it finally gave way. Inside, wrapped carefully in protective plastic sleeves, were additional notebooks denser and more complete than anything found in the upstate house, along with something else that made Farah's breath catch entirely. A sealed envelope, her name written across the front in her father's unmistakable handwriting. "For Farah, if anything should happen to me." Her hands shook so badly she could barely open it, and Nathaniel crouched beside her, his voice gentle. "Take your time." Inside was a letter, several pages long, and as Farah began to read, her father's voice filled her mind so vividly it felt as though he were sitting right beside her. "My dearest Farah, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you directly what I've come to suspect about your husband. I've spent months watching him circle closer to my work, asking questions that feel less like curiosity and more like calculation. I don't know if I'm right to be suspicious. I hope for your sake that I am wrong. But I've decided I cannot risk everything I've built disappearing into someone else's name without protection. So I've hidden the complete research here somewhere. He'll never think to look somewhere only you would know, to search if the truth ever demanded it. If you're reading this letter, it likely means my fears were correct, and I am deeply sorry for whatever pain that truth has caused you. But know this, my darling girl. The cascade method, the complete algorithm, everything Richard has likely built his success upon, exists here in its true, original, unaltered form, time-stamped and notarized independently through a colleague I trust completely, Dr. Elena Vasquez at Cornell, who witnessed my work firsthand years before Richard ever entered our lives. Her testimony combined with these notebooks should be more than sufficient to prove without question whose mind truly built what he claims as his own. I love you more than any equation could ever express. Reclaim what's yours. Reclaim what's ours. Your father always. Farah lowered the letter, tears streaming freely now, and for a long moment, no one in the small cabin spoke, the weight of Arthur Montgomery's foresight settling over all of them like something sacred. "He knew," Farah finally whispered. "He knew, and he protected it anyway for me." Nathaniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was uncharacteristically thick with emotion. Farah, this letter, combined with independent witness testimony from a colleague at Cornell, time-stamped notebooks predating Richard's patent filings by years, this isn't just strong evidence anymore. It's undeniable. Vivian finished, her own eyes bright with something like awe. This is the kind of evidence that doesn't just win a lawsuit, Farah. This is the kind of evidence that ends a career entirely publicly and irreversibly. Grace wrapped her arms around her sister, both of them crying now, grief and vindication tangled together in a way that felt for the first time in 6 long years like something close to peace. "We need to reach Dr. Vasquez immediately," Nathaniel said, already dialing. "If she can confirm authenticity and timeline in a sworn statement, we move to file within the week." As the sun began sinking lower over Silver Lake, casting long shadows through the cabin's dusty windows, Farah sat on the floor, surrounded by her father's life work, finally reclaimed after 6 years of silence, and felt something powerful settle into her chest, steady and unshakable. Somewhere back in the city, Richard Sterling had no idea that the foundation of his entire empire had just been unearthed from a forgotten stone hearth beside a lake he'd never once heard of, and within days the world was going to learn exactly how far a man would go to steal a dead man's brilliance, and exactly how far his widow was willing to go to take it back. Dr. Elena Vasquez answered on the third ring, and the moment Nathaniel explained who was calling and why, her voice shifted from polite confusion to something sharp and immediate. "Arthur Montgomery's daughter," she repeated, and Farah could hear papers shuffling on the other end of the line. "I've wondered for years if anyone would ever come asking about his work. I have copies of correspondence-dated emails discussing the Cascade method years before I ever heard the name Sterling FinTech. I witnessed early demonstrations of that algorithm myself in my own lab, in front of 2 graduate assistants who can corroborate everything I'm telling you." Farah gripped the phone tighter, sitting on the cabin floor, still surrounded by her father's notebooks. "Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement, formally understanding that this could become part of a very public legal case?" There was no hesitation on the other end. Arthur was a brilliant man who never got the credit he deserved while he was alive. If there's a chance to give him that credit now, I'll sign whatever needs signing, and I'll say it under oath in front of anyone who asks. By the time they returned to London that night, Vivian's team had already begun drafting the formal complaint, working through the evening with a kind of focused intensity that told Farah this was no longer theoretical. This was happening. Somewhere in a downtown office, printers were running late into the night producing exhibit after exhibit, time-stamped notebooks, forensic handwriting analysis, patent filing comparisons, and now Dr. Vasquez's sworn statement, arriving by encrypted email just before midnight, detailing dates, witnesses, and technical specifics that aligned perfectly with everything Farah had found in that hidden metal box. "This is airtight," Vivian said the next morning, spreading printed exhibits across the conference table with the satisfaction of a surgeon confirming a clean diagnosis. Time-stamped research predating the patent filing by 3 years, an independent credentialed witness with contemporaneous documentation, physical notebooks matching the exact structural methodology used in Sterling FinTech's core algorithm. "Farah, I don't say this lightly, but Richard doesn't have a defense here. Not a real one." "Then when do we file?" Farah asked, and there was no hesitation in her voice anymore, only a steady, focused resolve that had been building since the moment she knelt beside that stone hearth. "Tomorrow morning," Nathaniel said. "We file the complaint in federal court, and simultaneously we release a carefully controlled statement to select financial press, not a leak. A strategic disclosure timed precisely to prevent Richard's team from spinning the narrative before the facts are already public." Farah nodded, but something in her chest tightened at the scale of what was coming. "Once this is filed, there's no pulling it back." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "There isn't. Are you certain?" Farah thought of her father's letter, of his careful, quiet foresight of the 6 years he'd spent unknowingly protecting a truth that had waited patiently for her to find it. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said. The filing went out at 9 the following morning, and by 11, the first headlines had already begun rippling across financial news outlets. Sterling FinTech founder accused of stealing core algorithm from late father-in-law. By noon, Sterling FinTech stock had dropped 6% in early trading investors, reacting with the particular panic reserved for companies whose entire valuation suddenly seemed built on a foundation of sand. Farah sat in the London office watching the numbers fall in real time, feeling a strange, hollow mixture of triumph and grief, and her phone buzzed almost constantly. First Grace, then reporters who had somehow already found her new number, then finally a call she'd been both dreading and anticipating. Richard. She let it ring twice before answering, forcing her voice into something calm and unreadable. "Richard, what have you done?" His voice was raw, stripped of the cold composure she'd known for 14 years, replaced by something closer to panic. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? My board is calling emergency meetings. Investors are pulling out. My stock just lost 6% in 3 hours. Farah 6% because of some story you and Pierce cooked up together." I didn't cook up anything, Farah said evenly. I found my father's notebooks, Richard, the ones you told me you were storing safely after he died, complete with a letter he wrote me explaining exactly what he suspected you were doing years before you ever filed that patent. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Farah almost thought he'd hung up. Whatever you think you found, Richard finally said, his voice tight. It doesn't prove anything. Notebooks, old journal entries. That's not evidence. That's the ramblings of a dying man who never understood what real innovation required. Dr. Vasquez disagrees, Farah said quietly. She's already provided a sworn statement confirming she witnessed my father demonstrating the cascade method in her lab 3 years before your patent filing, with witnesses, with documentation. Another silence, longer this time, and when Richard spoke again, something in his voice had cracked entirely. You're going to destroy everything I built. You didn't build it, Richard. Farah's voice remained steady, though her heart was pounding. You stole it. From a man who trusted you enough to let you into his family, and then you spent years pretending his brilliance was your own. I'm not destroying anything that was ever legitimately yours. Farah. His voice shifted suddenly softer, pleading in a way she hadn't heard from him in years, not since the earliest days of their marriage, when he still needed her more than he needed anyone else. We can fix this, privately. I'll give you whatever settlement you want, more than you could ever imagine, if you just drop this now before it goes any further. Think about what this is going to do to both of us, to our history together, dragged through every headline in the country. You should have thought about that before you left me on a runway, Farah said, and for the first time since the airport, she felt no trace of the old ache that used to accompany conversations like this, no lingering hope that he might say something to make the last 14 years feel less like a lie. This isn't about money anymore, Richard. This was never really about money. This is about my father finally getting the credit you stole from him, and it's happening, whether you like it or not. She ended the call before he could respond, her hand steady in a way that surprised even her, and when she looked up, Nathaniel was watching her from across the room with something that looked almost like awe. He offered you money, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. He offered me everything, Farah said. And I don't want it. Not like that. Not as a payoff to disappear quietly. I want the truth on record permanently, where no one can ever erase it again. Over the following days, the story exploded far beyond anything Farah had anticipated. Major news outlets picked up the case. Financial analysts dissected every filed exhibit, and Sterling Fintech stock continued its steady punishing decline as institutional investors, spooked by the strength of the evidence, began quietly divesting. Richard's public relations team scrambled to control the narrative, releasing statements calling the claims baseless and vindictive, but each carefully worded denial only seemed to invite more scrutiny, more questions, more damage. Then 4 days after the filing, Vivian burst into the conference room with her laptop open, her expression a mixture of shock and fierce satisfaction. We just got something extraordinary, she said. One of Richard's original engineers, the same one who mentioned to Nathaniel months ago that Richard's breakthrough felt like it came out of nowhere, he's agreed to go on record, formally, with a full statement corroborating the timeline. Farah's heart pounded. What does he say? Vivian turned the laptop toward her, and Farah read through the statement quickly, her breath catching at the specificity of it, the engineer describing in detail the exact week Richard had arrived at the office with what he called a completed breakthrough after months of the team struggling with dead ends, describing Richard's uncharacteristic secrecy about where the sudden solution had come from, describing his own private suspicion never voiced at the time out of fear for his job, that something about the timing felt deeply wrong. This corroborates everything, Farah whispered. The notebooks, Dr. Vasquez's testimony, and now an internal witness confirming the exact same timeline from inside the company. Richard's defense is collapsing in real time, Nathaniel said, reading over her shoulder, his voice carrying something close to triumph. His legal team can dispute a grieving widow's memory. They can question notebooks with claims of forgery or misdated entries. But they cannot easily dismiss a former employee with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out corroborating independent witness testimony from a credentialed academic. This is the kind of evidentiary convergence that ends cases before they ever reach trial. That evening, as Farah sat reviewing the growing mountain of evidence with Vivian's team, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another reporter, but something made her open it. "This is Diane Sterling, Richard's mother. I need to speak with you. Please, it's about Arthur." Farah stared at the message for a long moment, her heart racing. She and Diane had never been close, a polite but distant relationship, maintained mostly for the sake of family gatherings, and the older woman had certainly never reached out to her directly like this. She showed the message to Nathaniel, who read it twice before speaking. This could be a trap. Richard could be using his mother to gather information or to pressure you emotionally into backing down. Or she could actually know something, Farah said slowly. Richard's father died when he was young. Diane raised him alone. If anyone might have noticed something strange about the timing of his sudden success all those years ago, it might be her. "If you meet with her, I want someone present," Nathaniel said. "Not me. My presence would only make her defensive if Richard's involved somehow. But someone from the legal team recording everything, just in case." Farah agreed, and the meeting was arranged for the following afternoon, a quiet cafe far from both Richard's usual circles and the media attention now following Farah's every move. Diane arrived looking older than Farah remembered gray, threading heavily through hair that used to be dark, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around a cup of tea she didn't drink. "Thank you for coming." Diane said, her voice quieter than Farah remembered. "I know this is strange given everything happening." "What did you want to tell me?" Farah asked gently, though every instinct was braced for manipulation. Diane was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her untouched tea. "I loved your father," she finally said, and the words hit Farah with unexpected force. "Not romantically, as a friend. Arthur and I met years before you and Richard ever married through a mutual colleague at a conference. He was kind to me during a very difficult period in my life. I never told Richard how close Arthur and I once were, mostly because by the time you two started dating, it seemed like ancient history, irrelevant." "I didn't know that," Farah said slowly. "There's more," Diane continued, her voice tightening. "Years ago, before any of this, before the algorithm, before Sterling FinTech even had a name, Richard came to me confused and frustrated. His original approach to the trading model wasn't working, and he was terrified of failing publicly after quitting a stable job to pursue it. I remember him telling me almost in passing that your father had shown him something incredible during a family dinner, some breakthrough approach to error correction he'd never seen before. He seemed almost obsessed with it. Farah's pulse quickened. "Did he ever say anything about using it, about taking it?" Diane's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked entirely unlike the composed, distant woman Farah remembered from family holidays. "Not directly, but months later when his company suddenly succeeded where it had been failing, I actually asked him if Arthur's ideas had helped him find his solution. He got very quiet, very defensive. He told me never to bring it up again, especially not around you. I should have pushed harder. I should have asked more questions. I've carried that guilt for years, Farah, watching him build an empire I always privately worried wasn't entirely his. Why are you telling me this now?" Farah asked, though part of her already understood. "Because I'm tired of protecting a lie that's hurt everyone it's touched," Diane said, wiping at her eyes. "Because Arthur deserved better than being erased from his own legacy. And because whatever happens to Richard now, whatever consequences he faces, he brought this on himself the moment he decided someone else's brilliance was his to take." "Would you be willing to say this formally?" Farah asked carefully. "As a witness." Diane's hands trembled around her teacup, and for a long moment, Farah thought she might refuse, might retreat back into decades of quiet complicity. But then, the older woman nodded slowly, tears still falling freely. "Yes," she said. "I owe your father that much. I owe you that much." The addition of Diane Sterling's testimony landed like a detonation once it became part of the public record days later. Richard's own mother, corroborating the timeline, confirming his private admission of using Arthur Montgomery's ideas, delivered a blow to his defense that no legal team could adequately counter. Financial analysts began openly speculating about criminal referrals, not just civil liability. Sterling Fintech's board convened an emergency session and within 48 hours released a statement announcing Richard's immediate removal as CEO, pending the outcome of the litigation. A stunning, humiliating collapse for a man who had built his entire identity around unquestioned genius. Farah watched the announcement break across every major financial outlet from the London office, feeling a complicated wave of emotions she hadn't fully anticipated. Vindication tangled with something that almost resembled grief for the marriage she'd once believed in. Her phone buzzed. Richard, calling for what felt like the 100th time that week. She almost let it go to voicemail again, but something made her answer this time. "They removed me," Richard said, his voice hollow, stripped of every ounce of the cold composure he'd carried on that tarmac just days ago. "The board removed me from my own company, Farah. Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand exactly what's happening," Farah said quietly. "You're finally facing consequences for something you should have faced 6 years ago." "I built that company," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I worked 18-hour days. I sacrificed everything. You stole a dying man's life work," Farah interrupted, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion beneath it. "And then you married his daughter to make sure no one would ever ask questions. Your own mother confirmed it, Richard. There's no version of this story where you're the victim." The line went silent for a long moment, and when Richard spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me, Farah? What will make this stop?" Farah closed her eyes, thinking of her father's letter, of his quiet, careful hope that she would one day reclaim what belonged to them both. "I don't want it to stop," she said finally. "I want the truth completely, publicly, permanently. And then, Richard, I want what's legally mine." She ended the call and for a long moment sat in silence, feeling the enormous weight of everything that had happened in the span of a single week settle over her grief and triumph, tangled together in a way she suspected would never fully separate. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying the particular quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan he'd spent months building finally reach its inevitable conclusion. "The board statement just triggered something else," he said. "Sterling Fintech's major investors are demanding an emergency shareholder meeting. They want resolution fast before the stock collapses entirely. Vivian believes this means Richard's team will be forced into settlement negotiations within days, not months." "What kind of settlement?" Farah asked. "The kind that ends with your name attached to the algorithm that built his fortune," Nathaniel said, "and a financial resolution that reflects exactly how much that recognition is worth." Farah looked out the window at the London skyline, thinking of her father hunched over his notebooks, thinking of 6 years of silence finally breaking open into truth, and felt something settle deep in her chest, steady and unshakable. "Then let's finish this," she said. "Let's finish what he started." Within days, word came that Richard's legal team had requested an emergency in-person settlement meeting, demanding it take place not in London, but back in New York, in Sterling Fintech's own boardroom, the very room where Richard had built and ruled his empire for a decade. Farah read the request twice, feeling something fierce and unshakable settle into her spine. "Tell them yes," she said. "Tell them I'll be there." The days leading up to the New York meeting stretched taut with a tension Farah hadn't felt since the tarmac itself every hour, bringing new developments that made the ground beneath Richard's empire shift further. Vivian's team worked around the clock, preparing for the possibility that settlement talks could collapse into full litigation, building contingency after contingency. While Nathaniel personally oversaw security arrangements for Farah's return to American soil, wary of how desperate Richard might become now that his back was fully against the wall. "I want you prepared for anything," Nathaniel told her the night before their flight, the two of them reviewing documents in the London office long after the rest of the team had gone home. "Richard's cornered men don't always behave rationally. He may come in ready to fight to the last breath, or he may come in broken begging. Either way, you need to walk into that boardroom knowing exactly what you want and refusing to be moved from it." "I know what I want," Farah said, And there was no hesitation in her voice anymore, none of the uncertainty that had gripped her on that runway a lifetime ago, or so it felt. I want my father's name attached publicly permanently to the algorithm he created. I want fair compensation reflecting exactly what that theft cost us both. And I want Richard to stand in that room and say it out loud in front of witnesses that he took something that was never his. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. That last part, he said carefully, an admission like that on record could expose him to criminal liability beyond the civil case. Fraud, theft of intellectual property. Are you prepared for what that might mean, Farah? Not just for him, for the spectacle this becomes for the rest of your life being tied publicly to this moment. Farah thought of her father's quiet, careful letter, hidden behind a stone hearth for 6 years, waiting patiently for the truth to find its way home. I've spent my whole adult life being defined by other people's decisions, she said, by Richard's ambitions, by what he needed me to be. I'm done being quiet, so someone else can be comfortable. If exposing the truth means my name becomes part of this story forever, then let it. At least it'll be my truth, not his lie. The flight back to New York felt different from the one that had carried her away just over a week earlier. No longer a woman fleeing catastrophe, but someone returning to claim what had always belonged to her. Grace met them at the airport, pulling Farah into a fierce hug the moment she cleared the gate. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Grace said, studying her sister's face. "I haven't," Farah admitted, "but I've never felt more awake." The morning of the meeting arrived gray and overcast, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. Farah dressed carefully, choosing a tailored black suit that felt like armor, and stood for a long moment in front of the mirror, studying the woman staring back at her, hardly recognizable as the same person who had stood shaking on that tarmac just over a week before. "Ready?" Grace asked from the doorway. "No," Farah said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Sterling FinTech's headquarters rose 40 stories above Manhattan glass and steel, gleaming even under the overcast sky. And Farah felt the weight of every memory the building held as she stepped out of the car. Memories of visiting Richard's office in the company's earliest, humbler days, of watching this tower rise floor by floor as his ambition outpaced everything else in his life, including her. The lobby fell into a hush the moment she walked through with Nathaniel and Vivian flanking her employees, pausing mid-conversation to stare recognition flickering across faces that had likely seen her photograph splashed across financial news for the past week. She kept her chin level, her pace steady, refusing to let the weight of their attention slow her stride. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless, and when the doors finally opened onto the executive boardroom, Farah found Richard already seated at the head of the long table, flanked by his legal team, his mother Diane seated quietly near the far end, her presence a silent testament to where her loyalties now stood. Richard looked older than she remembered the past week, having carved deep lines into a face that had always prided itself on flawless composure. "Farah." He rose slightly as she entered, an old habit of politeness that seemed almost grotesque given everything between them now. "Richard." She took a seat directly across from him, Nathaniel and Vivian, settling beside her, and for a long moment the room held its breath in silence. Richard's lead attorney cleared his throat, sliding a thick folder across the table. "We're prepared to discuss a settlement that resolves this matter comprehensively without further public escalation." "I'm listening," Farah said, though she made no move to open the folder. "Full financial compensation reflecting the intellectual property in question," the attorney continued, "structured as a licensing arrangement that allows Sterling FinTech to continue operating under proper attribution and payment terms to the Montgomery estate. We're prepared to offer $800 million structured over 5 years, along with formal public acknowledgement of Arthur Montgomery's contribution to the underlying technology." Farah felt Nathaniel tense slightly beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. She let the silence stretch, watching Richard's face, watching the careful mask he was struggling to maintain. "No," she said simply. The attorney blinked. "I'm sorry. $800 million structured over 5 years keeps Richard in a position of continued control," Farah said, her voice steady and clear. It lets him keep running the company he built on my father's stolen work, just with a new licensing fee attached, like a tax he pays to make the inconvenience of the truth go away. That's not acceptable." "Then what would be acceptable, Ms. Montgomery?" the attorney asked, an edge creeping into his voice. "Full transfer of intellectual property rights to the Montgomery estate effective immediately," Farah said. "A public statement issued by Richard personally, not by a PR team, acknowledging that the algorithm was developed by my father and used without authorization. Removal of Richard from any executive or board position at Sterling FinTech permanently. And a settlement figure that reflects not just the value of what was stolen, but the 6 years of profit generated from that theft, which by Vivian's calculations comes to approximately $1.2 billion. The room went utterly silent. Richard's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, and for a moment Farah thought he might actually stand and walk out exactly as he had walked away from her on that tarmac just over a week ago. "That's extortion," Richard said finally, his voice low and furious. "You're trying to destroy me completely." "No, Richard." Farah leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. "I'm trying to give my father back what you took from him. What happens to you afterward isn't extortion, it's consequences." Diane, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the tense room. Richard listened to her. "I've stayed quiet for years about what I suspected, and I won't stay quiet any longer. You need to accept these terms. Fighting this further will only expose you to worse, and you know it." Richard turned to his mother, betrayal and desperation warring across his features. "You're taking her side, after everything I've built, everything I've given you." "I'm taking the truth's side," Diane said softly, "which is more than you ever did for Arthur." The room fell into a tense, charged silence. Richard's attorneys exchanging worried glances, clearly aware that their client's composure was cracking in real time, threatening to undermine whatever negotiating position they'd hoped to maintain. "I need to speak with my client privately," the lead attorney finally said, rising from his chair. "Take your time," Nathaniel said evenly. "We're not going anywhere." 20 minutes passed in the small anteroom outside the boardroom. Farah pacing slowly while Vivian reviewed final figures with a calm efficiency that belied the magnitude of what was being decided just down the hall. When they were finally called back, and Richard's face had settled into something hollow and defeated, the fight visibly drained out of him. "We accept the terms," his attorney said, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "Full intellectual property transfer, public statement, and settlement figure, as outlined, structured as a lump sum payment within 90 days. Farah felt something powerful and unexpected settle over her, not quite triumph, something quieter and deeper, closer to peace. "I want to hear him say it," she said, looking directly at Richard. "Not a statement drafted by lawyers. I want to hear you say right now in this room that you took my father's work." Richard's jaw worked silently for a long moment, pride and humiliation battling visibly across his face, and Farah watched him unmoving, refusing to let him escape the moment. "I took it," Richard finally said, his voice barely audible. "I took your father's research, and I built my company on it, and I let everyone believe it was mine alone." "Louder," Farah said quietly, "so everyone in this room hears it clearly." Richard's eyes flashed with something like rage, but beneath it, something broken, something that finally understood there was no more room to maneuver, no more clever exit strategy left to deploy. "I stole Arthur Montgomery's algorithm," he said louder, this time his voice cracking on the admission. "I stole it, and I built my entire company, my entire life on something that was never mine to take." The silence that followed felt enormous, and Farah felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from grief this time, but from something that felt almost like her father's presence, finally fully vindicated after 6 long years of silence. "Thank you," she said quietly, and for the first time since the tarmac. She meant it not as gratitude toward Richard, but as a private word to her father wherever his memory now rested. As the meeting concluded and papers were drawn up for formal signature, Farah stepped out onto the private terrace attached to the executive floor, needing air, needing space to absorb the enormity of what had just happened. Nathaniel joined her a few minutes later, standing quietly beside her, as the city stretched out below them, gray and vast, and indifferent to the personal earthquake that had just reshaped one family's entire history. "You did it," Nathaniel said softly. "Your father would be proud." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," Farah admitted, turning to look at him fully for the first time, without the armor of strategy and calculation between them. "You could have exposed this yourself months ago, without ever needing me involved at all. Why did you wait? Why did you need me specifically?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, something vulnerable crossing his usually composed features. "Because the truth needed a face the world could believe in," he said. "Forensic accountants and patent filings convince courts, Farah, but they don't move public opinion. You did that. Your grief, your strength, watching you transform from a woman abandoned on a runway into someone capable of standing in that boardroom and demanding the truth out loud, that's what made this undeniable." Farah studied him carefully, understanding settling in slowly. "That's not the only reason, is it?" Something flickered across Nathaniel's expression, guarded and careful. "No," he admitted, "it isn't. But that's a conversation for another day. Once all of this has settled, once you've had time to simply breathe without a lawsuit hanging over every decision." Farah nodded, accepting the boundary he'd drawn, though something in his answer left a quiet warmth she hadn't expected to feel amid everything else happening around her. Her phone buzzed, Grace waiting anxiously outside. How did it go? Farah looked out over the city one final time before typing her response. "It's done." He admitted everything. "Dad finally gets his name back." "I'm so proud of you," Grace wrote back immediately. Mom and Dad both would be. Farah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past week finally begin to loosen its grip on her chest, replaced by something steadier, something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely her own. Behind her, through the glass walls of the boardroom, she could see Richard signing the final documents, his hands visibly trembling. His mother standing quietly beside him, no longer offering comfort, simply bearing witness to the consequences of choices made years ago that had finally inevitably come due. Farah turned away from the window and looked toward Nathaniel, toward the city, stretching endlessly beyond him, and felt for the first time since standing alone on that tarmac just over a week ago that whatever came next, she would face it, not as someone's abandoned wife, but as her father's daughter finally fully reclaimed. The formal announcement went out 3 days later, timed precisely by Vivian's team to coincide with the market opening, and Farah stood in the London office watching the press release populate across every major financial outlet. Simultaneously, her father's name finally appearing where it always should have been attached permanently to the algorithm that had built and now unmade an empire. Sterling FinTech confirms complete transfer of core intellectual property rights to Montgomery Estate. Founder Richard Sterling steps down from all executive and board positions amid confirmed intellectual property theft. Farah read the headline 3 times before the reality of it fully settled into her bones. Not a rumor anymore. Not a lawsuit working its way slowly through courts. Confirmed, permanent, public. Her phone rang almost immediately, Grace's name flashing across the screen. "It's everywhere," Grace said, breathless with something between shock and joy. "Farah, it's on every channel. They're calling it one of the biggest corporate fraud reveals in a decade." "I know," Farah said quietly, watching the numbers on the stock ticker continue their steady collapse on the screen behind Vivian's desk. "I'm watching it happen right now. How do you feel?" Farah considered the question honestly before answering. "Like I finally exhaled after holding my breath for 6 years." The settlement funds began processing within the week, and Farah found herself for the first time in her adult life facing a version of wealth that belonged entirely to her, untethered from Richard's name, built instead on her father's brilliance and her own refusal to disappear quietly. It should have felt triumphant, and in many ways it did, but grief still moved through her in unexpected waves, missing the version of her marriage she'd once believed was real, mourning the years spent loving a man who had never deserved the sacrifice. Nathaniel found her one evening on the terrace of the London apartment, staring out at a skyline that had become unexpectedly familiar over the past 2 weeks. "You've been quiet since the announcement," he said, joining her at the railing. "I keep waiting to feel nothing but satisfaction," Farah admitted. Instead, I feel everything at once. Relief, grief, anger I didn't even know I was still carrying. I gave that man 14 years, Nathaniel. 14 years of my life believing we were building something together when really he was just quietly extracting everything valuable from my family and discarding the rest. Grief doesn't disappear just because justice arrives, Nathaniel said gently. It just changes shape. You're allowed to hold both truths at once, Farah, that you're finally free and that freedom cost you something real. Farah looked at him carefully, studying the quiet steadiness that had anchored her through the most chaotic 2 weeks of her life. You've been remarkably patient with me through all of this, she said. More than I probably deserved given how little I understood about what I was walking into that first day. You underestimate yourself, Nathaniel said. You walked into that lounge a woman in shock, and within hours you were asking the right questions, making the right connections. I didn't create the fighter who took down Richard Sterling Farah. I just handed her the information she needed to remember she'd always been one. Something in his voice, careful and deliberate, made Farah's chest tighten with an awareness she'd been quietly avoiding since that first conversation at the airport. Nathaniel, she said slowly, you mentioned back at Sterling's headquarters that there was another reason you needed me involved specifically, a conversation for another day. Nathaniel's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through his usual composure. I did say that. Is today that day? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city rather than at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before. I've competed against Richard for 12 years, he said. Watched him take credit for things, watched him climb over people who trusted him. And I told myself my interest in exposing him was purely professional, purely strategic. But the moment I learned about your father's research, the moment I understood what Richard had actually done, it stopped being about business rivalry entirely. What was it about then? Farah asked quietly. You, Nathaniel said simply. I'd heard about you for years secondhand through industry gossip, through the careful, dismissive way Richard used to describe his wife at events I attended, like you were an accessory rather than a person. And then I found out what your father had built, what Richard had stolen, and I kept thinking about the woman married to the man responsible, wondering if she had any idea what was happening right under her own roof. I told myself I was building a case against Richard. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was also building a reason to finally meet you. Farah felt her breath catch the honesty in his words, landing somewhere unexpected and tender. That's either the most calculated thing anyone's ever said to me, she said slowly, or the most genuine. Both, probably. Nathaniel admitted, a small, rare smile crossing his face. I'm not going to pretend I'm a simple man, Farah, but what I feel watching you these past 2 weeks, watching you rebuild yourself from nothing, that part isn't calculated at all. Farah didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his admission settle alongside everything else she was still processing, grief and vindication. And now this unexpected tentative warmth blooming somewhere she hadn't expected to feel anything again so soon. I need time, she finally said. Not because of what you've just said, but because I need to know who I am outside of being someone's wife, someone's weapon, someone's cause. I need to rebuild myself as just Farah before I can consider being anything to anyone else. That's exactly the answer I hoped you'd give, Nathaniel said, and something in his sincerity made her believe him completely. Take whatever time you need. I'm not interested in rushing something worth building carefully. 2 weeks later, Farah stood in a rented apartment in Manhattan, her own name on the lease for the first time in 14 years, surrounded by boxes. She was slowly unpacking into a life that belonged entirely to her. Grace helped her arrange furniture, the two sisters working in comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional laughter, a normalcy Farah hadn't realized she'd missed until it returned. You could buy any penthouse in this city, Grace said, setting down a box labeled Dad's Notebooks with visible reverence. Why this place? It's nice, but it's not exactly billionaire living. Because I don't want billionaire living, Farah said, carefully arranging her father's notebooks on a new bookshelf. The green spines finally displayed openly after 6 years hidden in darkness. I want a life that feels like mine, built slowly on my own terms. I spent 14 years living inside someone else's ambition. I'm not interested in repeating that mistake even with money that's technically my own now. Her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, the date circled weeks earlier. The formal shareholder meeting where the final restructuring of Sterling FinTech would be announced publicly. The last chapter of the corporate collapse Richard had triggered the moment he chose betrayal over honesty. "You're really going?" Grace asked. "After everything, you want to sit in that room one more time?" "I need to see it through to the end," Farah said. "Not for Richard, for Dad." The boardroom felt different this time when Farah walked in, no longer a battlefield she was fighting to survive, but a room she now controlled the terms of entirely. Investors filled every seat, board members she recognized from years of galas and corporate dinners watching her with a mixture of respect and undisguised curiosity, and at the head of the table in a position that no longer belonged to him sat Richard, present only because the restructuring required his formal sign-off on final terms. He looked smaller than she remembered, stripped of the confidence that had once filled every room. He entered his tailored suit hanging slightly loose on a frame that seemed to have aged years in the span of a few weeks. "Ms. Montgomery." The interim CEO, a sharp, capable woman named Diane Wu, who had been elevated from the board specifically to manage the transition, rose to greet her. "Thank you for joining us. Your presence today formally acknowledging the restructuring terms means a great deal to the board and to our remaining investors." "I appreciate the invitation," Farah said, taking her seat with a composure that would have felt impossible 3 weeks earlier. The meeting proceeded with careful, deliberate precision. Terms of the intellectual property transfer read formally into record. The settlement figure confirmed publicly for the first time, $1.2 billion structured through a combination of licensing fees and direct compensation, officially transferring not just credit but genuine controlling ownership of the algorithm to the Montgomery estate. Sterling FinTech would continue operating, but now as a licensee, paying ongoing fees to Farah for the continued use of technology that had always rightfully belonged to her family. When the formal vote concluded unanimous approval from every board member present, Farah felt something powerful settle over her. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, complete sense of closure. Richard remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, but as the meeting adjourned and attendees began filing out, he approached her quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said. "You ended it the moment you decided my father's brilliance was yours to steal," Farah said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Everything after that was just consequence catching up to choice. I loved you once." Richard said something raw and unguarded, breaking through his carefully maintained composure for the first time since the tarmac. "Maybe you did," Farah said, and to her own surprise she found she believed it at least partially. "But loving someone doesn't excuse stealing from them, Richard. It just makes the betrayal cut deeper." She walked away from him, then out of the boardroom that had once represented everything he'd built on a foundation of theft, and didn't look back not once as the elevator doors closed behind her. Outside, Nathaniel was waiting exactly as he'd promised. He would be standing near the building's entrance, with his hands in his pockets, watching her approach with quiet, patient warmth. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Final," Farah said. "Completely, finally final." They walked together through the Manhattan streets, no particular destination in mind, simply moving through the city in comfortable silence, and Farah found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply present, unburdened by the weight of strategy or grief or the constant calculation that had defined the past 3 weeks. "What happens now?" Nathaniel asked eventually, "now that the case is settled, now that your father's name is restored?" Farah considered the question carefully, thinking of her father's notebooks arranged carefully on her new bookshelf, of Grace's laughter, filling an apartment that belonged entirely to her, of the strange, unexpected warmth she felt walking beside Nathaniel, through streets neither of them needed to rush through anymore. "I want to build something," she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "Not another company chasing profit for its own sake. A foundation, maybe in my father's name, supporting mathematicians and researchers who might never get the recognition they deserve while they're still alive to enjoy it, making sure what happened to him never happens quietly to anyone else." "That's a beautiful idea," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice carried genuine admiration rather than mere politeness. "I'll need help building it properly," Farah added, glancing at him sideways. Someone who understands corporate structure, legal protections, how to build something that actually lasts instead of just making headlines for a week and fading away. "I might know someone qualified for that," Nathaniel said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I was hoping you'd say that," Farah admitted, smiling back for the first time in longer than she could remember, without any grief tangled beneath it. 6 months later, the Arthur Montgomery Foundation for Mathematical Innovation opened its doors in a modest building near Columbia University, funded initially by a portion of Farah's settlement, dedicated to supporting independent researchers whose brilliant, unconventional ideas often struggled to find institutional backing. Farah stood at the podium during the opening ceremony, looking out at a room filled with mathematicians, former colleagues of her father's, journalists who had covered every stage of the sterling fintech collapse, and Grace sitting proudly in the front row with tears already gathering in her eyes. "My father spent his life believing that brilliance shouldn't require permission to exist," Farah said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the room. "He believed that ideas mattered more than the credentials or connections of the person who created them. He never lived to see his own work recognized the way it deserved to be, and for 6 years someone else wore that recognition as though it belonged to them." She paused, looking out at the faces watching her, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something that finally felt like peace rather than grief. "That injustice is corrected now, permanently, publicly, completely. But this foundation isn't about looking backward at what was taken. It's about looking forward, making sure the next brilliant mind who discovers something extraordinary doesn't have to fight as hard as my father did, doesn't have to watch someone else claim credit for their genius, doesn't have to die before the world finally understands what they built." The applause that followed felt different from anything Farah had experienced throughout the entire ordeal. No vindication, no triumph over an enemy. Simply quiet, genuine celebration of something good being built from something terrible. Afterward, as guests mingled and Grace hugged her fiercely, whispering how proud their father would have been, Farah found herself standing near the window, with Nathaniel watching the late afternoon light spill across a city that had witnessed her complete transformation over the past 6 months. "Sterling FinTech announced their new licensing terms today," Nathaniel said quietly. "The company survived restructured under new leadership, paying royalties directly to the foundation, now instead of to you personally. Richard's name doesn't appear anywhere in their public materials anymore. He's essentially disappeared from the industry entirely." "I know," Farah said. "I saw the announcement this morning." "Does that satisfy you?" Nathaniel asked, watching him fade into irrelevance rather than facing something more dramatic. Farah considered the question, honestly surprised by how clear her answer felt. "I don't need him destroyed dramatically," she said. "I needed the truth restored, and it has been. What happens to Richard now, whether he rebuilds quietly somewhere or fades away entirely, that's no longer my concern. I'm not interested in carrying his story alongside my own anymore. My story finally belongs entirely to me." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something warm and steady in his expression. "I think that's the most powerful thing I've heard you say since the day I met you on that tarmac," he said. "I think I finally understand what my father was trying to teach me all those years," Farah said, looking out at the city one final time before turning fully toward Nathaniel. "Power was never about controlling other people or destroying the people who wronged you. It was about reclaiming the truth of who you are, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many people try to convince you otherwise." She thought of the woman who had stood alone on that tarmac 3 months earlier, shattered and abandoned, believing her entire identity had been erased alongside her marriage. That woman felt impossibly distant, now replaced by someone who understood finally and completely that she had never actually been powerless at all. She had simply forgotten for a little while exactly how strong she'd always been. Farah Montgomery had not been rescued that day at the airport. She had been reminded of exactly who she was, and she had spent every day since proving it, not just to Richard, not just to the world watching her story unfold across headlines and courtrooms, but to herself. Her father's legacy lived on, not stolen, not hidden, not erased, but finally permanently restored exactly where it belonged. And Farah, standing tall in a life entirely her own, understood at last that some betrayals, however devastating in the moment, become the very foundation upon which a person discovers who they were always meant to become. The weeks following Sterling FinTech's public restructuring brought a strange, quiet unfamiliarity into Farah's days, the absence of crisis feeling almost disorienting after months spent moving from one emergency to the next. She woke each morning without a lawyer's call waiting on her phone, without headlines to monitor, without Richard's presence looming somewhere at the edge of every decision, and it took time to understand that this stillness wasn't emptiness. It was simply peace, something she'd forgotten how to recognize. Grace came by most weekends, the two sisters slowly rebuilding a closeness that Farah's marriage had quietly eroded over the years, without her ever noticing it happening. They cooked together in Farah's small kitchen, the kind of meals their mother used to make before she passed, and Farah found herself laughing in ways that felt entirely unguarded, entirely her own. "You seem lighter," Grace observed one evening, watching her sister move around the kitchen with an ease that had been absent for years. "Even during the divorce, even before any of this happened with Richard, you always seemed like you were holding your breath. I didn't realize it until now, watching you finally exhale." "I didn't realize it either," Farah admitted, setting 2 plates on the table. "I think I spent so many years trying to be exactly what Richard needed me to be that I forgot what it felt like to just be myself. Not performing gratitude for the life he gave me, not shrinking myself to make room for his ambition, just existing as Farah without an audience to please. Dad would be so proud of you," Grace said softly, and this time when tears rose in her eyes, Farah reached across the table and held her sister's hand, the two of them sitting together in shared grief and shared pride, finally able to hold both without either one overwhelming the other. The foundation's work expanded faster than Farah had anticipated, applications pouring in from researchers across the country, brilliant minds working in isolation, unsupported by institutions too rigid to recognize unconventional genius. She spent hours reviewing proposals personally drawn particularly to applicants working in mathematical fields her father had once explored, feeling a strange, tender continuity in supporting exactly the kind of work that had once been dismissed as impractical, unmarketable until someone else stole it and made billions. Nathaniel remained a steady presence throughout, though he never pushed beyond the careful boundaries Farah had set, allowing their relationship to grow, slowly built on genuine partnership rather than urgency. They worked together most days on foundation business, and slowly, without either of them naming it directly, something warmer began threading through their professional conversations, lingering glances, an ease of laughter that hadn't existed during those first frantic weeks of legal warfare. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said one evening, the two of them reviewing grant proposals in the foundation's modest office long after everyone else had gone home, "about something you said back in London, about needing to know who you were outside of being someone's wife, someone's cause." Farah looked up from the papers spread across her desk. "I remember. Do you feel like you know now?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet vulnerability she'd come to recognize as entirely genuine, nothing calculated about it at all. Farah considered the question seriously, thinking of the woman who now stood at podiums, delivering speeches about her father's legacy, who ran a foundation entirely her own, who had rebuilt an apartment and a life, and a sense of self from the wreckage Richard had left behind on that runway. "I think I do," she said finally. "I think for the first time in longer than I can remember, I actually know exactly who I am." "And who is that?" Nathaniel asked softly. Farah smiled, something steady and sure settling into her chest. "Someone who isn't afraid anymore," she said. "Someone who finally understands that real power was never about someone else's validation. It's about knowing your own worth so completely that no one can ever convince you otherwise again." Nathaniel reached across the desk, his hand covering hers gently, not urgent, not demanding, simply present. "I'd like to be part of whatever comes next," he said, "whenever you're ready for that." "I think," Farah said slowly, turning her hand to hold his properly, "I might be ready sooner than I expected." 1 year after that devastating morning on the Teterboro tarmac, Farah stood once again on a private runway, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. The jet waiting before her wasn't Richard's gleaming white Gulfstream carrying betrayal disguised as luxury. It was matte black, sleek and commanding, purchased entirely with her own money, registered entirely in her own name, a symbol she'd chosen deliberately, remembering the exact words she'd once spoken to Nathaniel in a moment of unexpected humor amid unbearable grief. "I think I'll buy my own jet, matte black." She'd meant it as a joke that day, a small act of defiant humor in the face of devastation. Now watching the aircraft gleam under the afternoon sun, she understood it as something more, a promise she'd made to herself without fully realizing it, a declaration that she would never again depend on someone else's wealth, someone else's permission, someone else's timeline for her own life. Grace stood beside her along with several Foundation board members preparing for a research summit in Geneva that Farah herself had organized, bringing together mathematicians and scientists whose work might otherwise have remained unrecognized for years, just as her father's had. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked, appearing at her side, his hand finding hers naturally now, without hesitation, without the careful boundaries that had once defined their early partnership. "More than ready," Farah said, and as she walked up the stairs of her own jet engines, humming with quiet, powerful readiness, she felt no trace of the devastation that had once anchored her to this exact kind of runway, no echo of abandonment or humiliation. She felt only the steady, unshakable certainty of a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing, who had reclaimed not just her father's legacy, but her own identity piece by piece, choice by choice, until what remained was entirely permanently her own. Richard Sterling had once told her she would land on her feet, meaning it as a dismissal, a careless assumption that she would simply fade into whatever quiet, diminished life he assumed she deserved. He had been right, though, not in any way he could have predicted. Farah Montgomery had landed on her feet, not by surviving what he'd done to her, but by rising so far beyond it that his cruelty became nothing more than the final push she'd needed to discover exactly how powerful she had always been. The jet lifted into the sky, carrying her toward a future built entirely on her own terms. Her father's legacy secured her own identity, fully reclaimed, and as the ground fell away beneath her, Farah understood with complete, unwavering certainty that she had never truly lost anything that mattered. She had simply been waiting to remember who she was.